Thank you, Phil Cantu, and thank you, Mike. And welcome back, everyone, to the 2021 ICA. We're holding our meeting virtually for this iteration. I also wanted to say good afternoon and buenas tardes to our colleagues in Mexico. We're thrilled that everybody's here this afternoon. We have a very full and exciting program, and it's going to begin with a very special panel that our co-organizers organized on COVID-19 and Latinos. Our co-organizers this year, which were Kyriakos Markides, Veronica Montes de Oca, and Rogelio Saenz, have worked all year long putting together this magnificent program along with Phil Cantu and our CAA advisory group providing guidance. So we really are happy to see that we have a special focus and spotlight on this critical issue, because as we've learned that many of our investigators have published quite extensively in our first presentation here as part of this panel on the risk of mortality. As Octavio Martinez has summarized yesterday, our Latino population has been highly vulnerable to the global COVID pandemic. And we need to really update ourselves and consider these issues very seriously when we're focusing on resilience and health in the Latino and Mexican American populations. So I want to just introduce everyone who will be serving on this panel. Will be Rogelio Saenz, and who is currently a professor of demography at the College of Health, Community and Policy at the University of Texas at San Antonio, one of our sister schools here at UT. And his co-author is Mark Garcia, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Syracuse University at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Following their presentation on COVID-19 death trends among older Latinos, looking at trends from 20 to 21, very timely, we will then transition to Veronica Montes de Oca. Veronica is a senior investigator at the Institute of Social Investigation at the National Autonomous University in Mexico. And her colleague, Teleforas Ramirez, is also a research investigator at the Regional Multidisciplinary Research Center at UNAM. Following their presentation, Kyriakos Markides is the Annie and John Nitzinger Distinguished Professor of Aging and at the University of Texas Medical Branch in the Department of Preventive Medicine and Community Health. Many of you know Dr. Markides, as he is the founding editor and current editor also of the Journal of Aging and Health. Along with Dr. Markides, Phil Cantu will be making that presentation. And Dr. Cantu is a NIA postdoc at the Seeley Center on Aging at the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston. We will have time for questions and answers. Please post those in the chat so we can make sure that we want to have as much robust discussion as possible, given the importance of this topic. With that said, I'd like to again encourage a lot of discussion, and we'll begin with our first presentation by Rogelio Saenz and Mark Garcia. Rogelio?
Yeah, Mark will start it off.
Yes, I will begin the presentation. Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes.
And I just want to quickly acknowledge, as I think back, this is my eighth, I believe, ECA that I'll be attending. And I want to thank Jackie very much for the invitation and performing this platform that has helped so many of us at different levels of our careers get together and share our research in a welcoming environment. I think for me, it's been very important as an early investigator, and I would venture that others would say the same. So thank you very much for that opportunity, Jackie.
You're welcome.
So here we go. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay, so the title of our presentation today is The Impact of COVID-19 on Older Latino Mortality, a tale of two periods, 2020 and 2021. Very briefly, we know that the coronavirus is a respiratory disease caused by SARS-CoV-2, and it was discovered in 2019. Early on, we published work that was consistent with other findings that COVID-19 mortality was particularly detrimental among older adults, as well as those with underlying health conditions. But also among the older adult population, we documented racial and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 mortality, with both African-American and Latino older adults exhibiting a disproportionate burden of COVID-19 mortality relative to non-Latino whites. We also published another paper looking specifically at different age groups to see the impact across these age groups and across race and ethnicity. And as you could see here, this is the COVID death rates that I'm illustrating per 100,000 population. And Latinos were already exhibiting higher mortality once again, which we demonstrated. But the important thing that we tried to show here is that the Latino paradox, that is the mortality paradox in regards to COVID-19, was diminishing and in many cases no longer evident. Here we showed, looking at other non-COVID deaths, that is all other deaths non-COVID related, that Latinos still demonstrated a lower mortality. So the paradox was still evident in non-COVID-19 mortality. However, looking at the two, we see particularly under the 65 to 74 age group that the paradox had already diminished and was no longer evident. Whereas in these other groups, the paradox has been diminishing. Excuse me. During this same period, there were other studies published. Here we have results from Andresfe and Goldman that documented a decline in total life expectancy and life expectancy at age 65 due to COVID mortality. And here they demonstrate the decline, how it looks over time. And shortly after this period, Elizabeth Arias and the group from CDC also mirrored these results. What I would like to point out from these studies is that among Latino males exhibited the largest decline in life expectancy, that is 3.7 years. And conversely, Latino females exhibited 2.0 decline in life expectancy. And this is very, very important because what research has shown us, a preponderance of evidence has shown us, is that the Latino mortality paradox is particularly more robust among older males. Here, I'm going to stop and Rogelio will take over the presentation. Thank you.
You're on mute, Rogelio.
Okay, I always have that problem. Thank you very much, Jackie, also for the invitation to organize this session. The data that we've been using is comes from the CDC. These are data that are updated every week and have race and ethnicity data as well as age categories. And this particular data set is also broken down by states. So let's see. So when Mark and I published the article that appeared in the journals of gerontology that was talking about, we had found at that time that there was a 65 to 74 age category where if you took all the deaths together, we found that for Latino 65 to 74 years of age had death rates, overall death rates that were higher than the white population. And we predicted that based upon the trends that we were going to see this taking place in the 55 to 64 group as well as the 75 to 84. As you can see at that time, this particular chart gives you different time periods. So in August the 30th, these are cumulative data all the way from January 1st, 2000 to August 30, 2020, not 2000. We saw that for the most part, it was very close in the 55 to 64 and 75 to 84. Subsequently, by late January, we found that the paradox then had disappeared with respect to all deaths for the 55 to 64 category, and that persisted until the end of May. And we've seen the reversal now where since June, we've seen then that Latinos actually have a slightly lower overall death rate. It has persisted over the 65 to 74 age category for all the time periods here, even in the latest data that we have available, September 11th, 2021, Latinos have a death rate that is about 1.3% higher than the white population. And with a 75 to 84, we were showing that it was likely to take place, but as you can see, for the most part, all that period, Latinos have lower death rates, and as well as with the 85 and older, which mirrors kind of the last 10, 20 years of data that we have. And this particular file here provides you for the 10 states, the 10 largest states on the basis of the Latino population. These are the age-specific death rates associated with COVID. And there are particular patterns. And here I have two sets here. We have 2000 at the top and then 2021. And these are the ratios of the Latino to white age-specific death rates associated with COVID, the first 5 states and then the next 5 states. Some of the common trends that we find is, one, there have been major improvements in terms of the reduction of the ratio in places like Texas, places like New York that was hit very hard at the beginning, Illinois as well. We can see those changes, as well as North Carolina, which is a new destination place. And if you remember, North Carolina was one of those meatpacking places that you have seen the surges that were taking place back in 2000. Then there are those that are kind of the somewhat moderate kind of changes that we see, for example, in Florida, right here, Florida. We see it in Arizona, kind of moderate changes, New Jersey, and Colorado as well. And then the minor change that we see is in California. You can see that there has been some improvements, but for the most part, for example, 55 to 64, they were dying at 6.6 times higher in 2020 and then 5.2 times higher in 2021. One of the things that you see is the improvements have been much better at the ages 55 to 64 and 65 to 74. And these are likely people who were working, who continued working and were vulnerable to the pandemic. And those are the improvements that we've seen over time. And then we can also take a look at the overall deaths, and this is one that is associated with the paradox, because we're looking at all deaths taken together. And there are some particular trends that we find. One of these is in the new destination states of Georgia and North Carolina. And there what you find is that for the most part, Latinos were still, the paradox was holding both in 2020 and 2021 in those particular locations. As you can see, things where the paradox was holding in 2020 and then as well as 2021. And there you see the continuation of much lower death rates for all causes in the among Latinos compared to whites. On the other hand, you have minor improvements that have taken place in Texas, for example, minor improvements there. And then we have little to no change in Florida, for example, right here, Florida, which the paradox for the most part held with the exception of the 85 and older in 2020. And then we don't have any groups associated with the paradox in 2021, as well as in, okay, and then again, we see California. California is the one where we've seen worsening of situation where even for the younger age categories, that gap has expanded even for the other two categories as well. Right now, California is a state in 2021 that 3 of the 4 age groups, right here, these 3 age groups, whites, Latinos have higher death rates compared to the white population. Now, what are the factors that are associated with this shift? One has been the major COVID surges that impacted Latinos, Blacks, and Native Americans, very early major surges that took place early on. More recently, we've had white surges that have been associated with the opposition to the vaccination, particularly in the 55 to 64 age categories. And then also Latinos have gotten vaccinated in areas, particularly in COVID areas that have been, where Latinos have been impacted by COVID drastically. And there's also the whole thing with the age cohorts, that it may be that the older age cohorts, 75 to 84, as well as 85 to 84, where we haven't seen the paradox in general taking place, that this may be some health differences between those two and the younger two age categories. And just, I'll conclude here with this map that appeared in an article in the Washington Post yesterday. And it shows areas of the country, for example, that have the highest levels of vaccination, the darker. And we can see that in Texas, in the borderland, except in this, the place associated with Big Bend and so forth, we've seen that the border areas, for the most part, have been among the highest vaccination rates, and particularly in my home region, the Valley area, that had been tremendously hard hit back in July, August, and September, that people are getting vaccinated. And with that, we conclude our presentation.
Thank you very much, Rogelio and Mark, for a very informative presentation, much to discuss. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next paper, which is by Veronica Montes de Oca and Teleforth Ramirez. And the title of their presentation is Vulnerability and Resilience in Older Persons in COVID-19 Pandemic in Mexico. Veronica?
Muchísimas gracias, Jackie. Pues yo me siento muy contenta porque hoy hacía memoria de que nos conocimos en el 2005 en Río de Janeiro, en el Congreso de la IAG, y ahí conocí también a Cocos. Cocos, recordarás que ahí nos conocimos a todos por primera vez, y desde ese momento hemos establecido un vínculo que para mí no solamente es un vínculo académico, sino también es un vínculo entre nuestros países. Y es un vínculo que fortalece la cultura mexicana y la preocupación por una población sumamente importante, que es la población latina. Y bueno, presentamos este documento sobre la vulnerabilidad de las personas mayores ante COVID en México, pero donde introducimos una parte muy importante sobre resiliencia que nos pareció interesante a partir de otro proyecto que estamos realizando con la Universidad de Stirling en Escocia. Y bueno, el objetivo, como ustedes pueden ver de este trabajo que presentamos, es justamente analizar las vulnerabilidades de la población adulta mayor, y lo estamos haciendo desde varios enfoques. Ayer Octavio mencionaba los determinantes sociales de la salud. Y nosotros también hablaremos de ello, pero adicionando las desigualdades acumuladas que tienen las personas mayores y que por desgracia en las últimas 3, 4 décadas se han incrementado. Entonces, hoy vamos a ver también cómo ellos, a partir de este gran problema de COVID, han actuado también con una perspectiva resiliente y a través de su persona, pero también a través de sus familias. Y entonces, para ello, estamos utilizando la información del Ministerio de Salud, la Dirección General de Epidemiología, quien desde marzo del año pasado nos han dado información, desde abril del año pasado hasta este marzo, es donde tenemos estos datos. Utilizamos información también del censo de población que se levantó exitosamente el año pasado. Y para dar un contexto sobre esas desigualdades acumuladas en las personas mayores, utilizamos 2 encuestas muy valiosas en México de hace 3 años, que es la encuesta nacional de la dinámica demográfica y la encuesta nacional de salud y nutrición, que también sabemos es sumamente importante. Finalmente, presentamos algunos avances de esta investigación cualitativa que estamos realizando y en donde la resiliencia es un factor muy importante. Vamos a comenzar dando un poquito del contexto a nivel mundial. La primera información que llegó a México es la información sobre las muertes de las personas mayores en Europa, principalmente en Italia, después obviamente en Alemania, Francia, España, y hay un recorrido en la geopolítica del mundo hasta que llega a México. Se pensaba que solamente las personas mayores podían ser infectadas y eran las únicas que podían transmitir el virus. Y eso comenzó a generar un proceso de estigmatización muy fuerte en toda América Latina, que afortunadamente en nuestro país, a través del gobierno de la Secretaría de Salud, se pudo obviamente eliminar esa visión estigmatizante y se volvió una perspectiva protectora. Y posteriormente, obviamente, no teníamos muchísima evidencia, ninguna parte del mundo tenía evidencia sobre esto. Así que todos estábamos experimentando, obviamente, muchos cambios, muchas formas diferentes de ver la forma en que los gobiernos iban a reaccionar, pero también cómo esta pandemia estaba contagiando a distintas personas, distintas poblaciones en el mundo. Es por eso que nosotros analizamos esta información y la hicimos a partir de la Dirección General de Epidemiología, que constantemente estaba alimentando toda la información con datos sumamente importantes. Y quiero mencionar aquí, toda la población, a través de toda la Organización de Salud, estaban, por supuesto, reportando esta información. Y lo que vemos es que prácticamente pareciera que la población que dio positivo, tanto de hombres y mujeres, estos casos acumulados de personas que se contagiaron de COVID-19, pareciera que es más o menos equilibrada. Pero como bien señaló también Rogelio y como ayer Rebeca y Octavio mencionaron, las desigualdades estructurales que tienen los hombres y las mujeres y los distintos grupos de la población hicieron que la reacción del COVID tuviera efectos mucho más alarmantes, sobre todo en ciertos grupos de la población, en este caso en las personas adultas mayores y especialmente en aquellos con comorbilidades, que como sabemos ya no hablamos de pandemia nada más, sino hablamos de sindemia. Pero el hecho de tener obesidad, diabetes, hipertensión, no es una cuestión aleatoria. No es una cuestión que solamente haya venido de la nada, sino que tiene mucho que ver con la desigualdad que tienen estas personas y también con los determinantes sociales. Es decir, nosotros partimos de que las personas mayores tienen una trayectoria de salud y enfermedad que se ha acumulado en los últimos 40 años de su vida y que mucho tiene que ver con la pérdida de la adscripción en términos de salud, de la práctica preventiva en las enfermedades de esta población, obviamente de estilos de vida que entraron en el circuito de la industria, del mercado, del consumismo, y que obviamente no es solamente una elección de las personas. Nosotros partimos de que hay una desigualdad social, hay una desigualdad económica, hay una desigualdad estructural que obviamente hace que las personas tengan determinadas condiciones de salud y de discapacidad para enfrentar la enfermedad. Igualmente, muchas personas mayores en este periodo del 2020 al 2021 vieron interrumpidos tratamientos de salud porque la estrategia que siguió el gobierno, que a mí en lo personal me parece muy plausible, fue reconvertir muchos institutos, muchas clínicas y hospitales para poder atender la demanda de servicios, sobre todo en términos intensivistas en el país. Entonces se tuvo que reducir en gran medida todo lo que tiene que ver con los tratamientos hacia las personas mayores con diabetes, con hipertensión, con cáncer y otro tipo de enfermedades. Cuando vemos los datos de la población adulta mayor afiliada, no afiliada a los sistemas de salud, realmente nos damos cuenta de que mucho de la estrategia de los últimos gobiernos fue insuficiente. Y puede ser que todavía lo siga siendo. Pero lo cierto es que una quinta parte de las personas adultas mayores en México no estaban afiliadas a ningún sistema de salud. Y esto, obviamente, si lo pensamos desde una perspectiva retrospectiva, nos permite advertir que eran personas que no tenían una actitud de cuidado y tratamientos que pudieran disminuir la respuesta ante el COVID-19. Igualmente, sabemos que nuestro país vivió varios procesos de desmantelamiento del sistema de salud, de privatización de los servicios médicos y también de no formación de médicos especialistas. Según cifras del propio subsecretario de Salud, hacen falta en el país más de 250,000 doctores, médicos especializados. Y obviamente esto va a ser sumamente importante, por eso hemos recurrido en el país a médicos de Cuba, a muchos otros de Venezuela que han venido a apoyar en ciertos momentos de crisis en el país. Entonces, obviamente, este proceso de privatización, esta pérdida de la población del servicio, del derecho que tienen a la atención, no es una cuestión meramente transversal, es una cuestión que se sigue en el tiempo. Cuando vemos los datos de esta población adulta mayor no afiliada, nos damos cuenta efectivamente que esta quinta parte de la población adulta mayor, sobre todo los más envejecidos y los más, digamos, podríamos decir, los relativamente jóvenes, los que inician la etapa de vejez, tienen una mayor desprotección en salud. Pero quiero que noten este color marrón, que especialmente son los hombres. Nosotros hemos escrito otro documento también importante sobre esta sociodemografía de la desigualdad, que tiene una lectura de género muy importante y nosotros lo correlacionamos, desgraciadamente no tenemos cómo comprobar esto, pero lo correlacionamos con el crecimiento del mercado de trabajo informal, en la que básicamente están los hombres ocupados. Esto que Boaventura de los Santos llama la uberización del mercado de trabajo, la precarización que se ha dicho y se ha escrito en muchísimos documentos sobre el mercado de trabajo. Y que, como ustedes recuerdan, en México solamente 30% de la población adulta mayor tiene una pensión. Y aun cuando la tienen, siguen trabajando porque la pensión es muy baja. Entonces, lo que está sucediendo es que muchas personas mayores siguen trabajando y siguen trabajando bajo el riesgo de no tener una institución de salud que los proteja. Pero además de eso, cuando vemos la información de la Encuesta Nacional sobre Salud y Nutrición, nos damos cuenta que las personas adultas mayores, fundamentalmente, fíjense ustedes, las mujeres y hombres en hipertensión y también en colesterol alto, obesidad, y por supuesto diabetes, pues son porcentajes muy altos, sobre todo en ciertas edades que vamos a ver, es sumamente importante de tomar en cuenta porque esta desigualdad estructural frente al COVID no solamente son las categorías tradicionales que hemos pensado, género, edad, clase social, lugar de residencia, sino también ahora se suma una categoría más, que aquí me pongo en sintonía con lo que ayer mencionaba Octavio, que es esta desigualdad ante la salud. Las categorías de nuestro propio sistema inmunológico, nuestra capacidad de resistir ante la nueva pandemia. Y obviamente, esta población adulta mayor que tuvo condiciones de intubación y de hospitalización, pues mostró en la evidencia es que la hipertensión tiene un lugar muy importante junto con la diabetes y la obesidad. Pero esto no es por default. Creo que el reto de esta experiencia pandémica en todo el mundo es justamente recuperar a Fries y retardar lo más posible la enfermedad, las enfermedades crónicas. En México, yo creo que en los últimos 30 años se olvidaron de Fries y empezaron obviamente, estos procesos que yo digo de privatización de los servicios de salud, pero además del incremento de esta precarización en el mercado laboral y que por supuesto nos agarró a mucha población totalmente descuidada para poder enfrentar la enfermedad por COVID, la enfermedad de COVID. Cuando vemos esta gráfica, vemos aquí a la población, a toda la población mexicana, graficada por grupos quinquenales, nos damos cuenta que efectivamente la población adulta mayor y especialmente los hombres, los hombres mexicanos, desde edades, fíjense ustedes muy bien, desde los 30 años, que ya padecen algún tipo de enfermedad crónico-degenerativa, están viviendo este padecimiento. Pero no es solamente eso, sino las secuelas que esta enfermedad va a tener en el futuro debe de ser un tema sumamente importante para la Secretaría de Salud y para todas las secretarías de Estado, porque tiene que ver, esto se tiene que vincular con el mercado de trabajo, se tiene que vincular también con el Ministerio de Educación. Aquí tenemos un serio problema porque dependiendo del momento en el curso de vida de las personas donde se está padeciendo el COVID, inician posiblemente secuelas futuras. Cuando lo estamos viendo por el tipo de enfermedad, nos damos cuenta que, por ejemplo, en edades tempranas, la diabetes y la hipertensión tienen un papel también muy importante que no es menor. No es población adulta mayor, pero es población que está envejeciendo con secuelas. Y esto es sumamente importante porque a partir de este momento que nosotros consideramos es un punto de inflexión, es un turning point para la humanidad y cada país lo va a ver de manera distinta. Sin duda, esto va a ser en el curso de vida de las personas un momento sumamente importante. En esa medida, cuando estamos analizando esta información con lo que ya sabíamos de la precarización del mercado de trabajo, de las repercusiones que la desigualdad tiene sobre la población y lo sumamos con la reflexión de la pandemia, obviamente nos damos cuenta que hay muchísimos aspectos de economía, de seguridad relacionados con el estrés y con los derechos humanos que hoy se ponen en crisis. Pero hay algo que es sumamente importante y particular de esta pandemia. Las personas más pobres del mundo podían no tener recursos económicos, pero tenían recursos sociales. Tenían familia, comunidad, vínculos con los que enfrentar muchísima de la penuria y de la pobreza. Con esta enfermedad COVID-19, nuestros vínculos ahora son virtuales. Nuestras relaciones humanas están limitadas por 2 metros de distancia y obviamente la alimentación afectiva de estos vínculos se deteriora. Entonces, algo que es sumamente importante es ver cómo esta misma pandemia no solamente está transformando la salud de las personas, su economía, sino también los vínculos que tienen. Y dentro de esos grandes impactos está la parte económica de la población y la dependencia que en cierta medida se ha tenido por distintos programas de gobierno, por el retiro o pensión que se tiene, pero si ustedes se dan cuenta, los ingresos son muy bajos, como la gran, digamos, fuente de ingreso de la población adulta mayor. Y entonces lo que nos estamos dando cuenta en México es que la pandemia por COVID-19 no solamente afecta en términos de salud, sino que se conjuga con una gran precarización de ingresos y una gran necesidad de apoyos económicos. Y para ponerle todavía un poquito más de negatividad al asunto, se ven muy disminuidos nuestros vínculos sociales. Entonces, ahí es cuando nosotros, a partir de lo que nos invitaron a reflexionar sobre la resiliencia, que no es un tema que en realidad nosotros trabajáramos, pero sí tenemos, Telésforo y yo, mucho tiempo trabajando sobre, incluso con el doctor Sainz, trabajando las redes de apoyo, las redes transnacionales, los sistemas de cuidado y, por supuesto, las formas en que la población, aún con desventaja, puede hacer frente a la adversidad. Entonces, partiendo de esto, en el proyecto que estamos realizando con la Universidad de Escocia, estamos midiendo la conexión social que tienen las personas mayores para enfrentar la pandemia. Y lo que hemos analizado también ahí, por supuesto, es la resiliencia, es decir, los instrumentos, los recursos, la movilización de recursos que tienen las personas mayores para enfrentar la adversidad. Y distinguimos que hay dos tipos de resiliencia, la individual, pero también la comunitaria. Y esto es muy interesante en esta pandemia, porque de alguna manera también lo que estamos viendo es cómo las redes, la familia, la comunidad, con todas las precauciones frente al confinamiento, están actuando para poder enfrentar el aislamiento de muchos de las familias, la pobreza, incluso las estrategias de cuidado que se han establecido en las familias, entre los vecinos, sobre todo cuando ves que una persona mayor está sufriendo de esta enfermedad. Y yo voy a mencionar solamente tres aspectos. Sí, con mucho gusto, voy cerrando. Cuando vemos, uno de los aspectos muy importantes es que los recursos sociales cambiaron en esta pandemia. Las personas, las familias ya no se pueden de alguna manera vincular con la misma facilidad que se hacía antes, porque obviamente los lazos también ahora pueden contagiarte. Entonces, hay estrategias distintas que la población está instrumentando. Incluso la literatura habla muchísimo de las brechas tecnológicas con las personas mayores y los más jóvenes, pero ahora también las personas mayores se han enfrentado a seleccionar, optimizar y compensar la ausencia del manejo de la tecnología. Esto con tal de mantener los vínculos sociales, mantener las redes de apoyo y poder evidentemente hacer frente de una manera resiliente a la adversidad. Y obviamente ahora, por ejemplo, es algo muy interesante, los chats grupales, por ejemplo, que nos habla de una resiliencia comunitaria también para hacer frente a esta pandemia, pero donde un aspecto que nos pareció sumamente un hallazgo muy interesante fue la selectividad, la optimización y la compensación, que ya gerontólogos hace muchas décadas atrás, como Baltes y Cartensen, han mencionado es fundamental. Entonces, sí vemos que esta resiliencia, estas redes de apoyo que nos hablaba ayer Rebecca Wong, se están dando de una manera distinta y obviamente frente a la adversidad y hacer frente no solamente a la pandemia, sino también a los efectos nocivos de esta pandemia con la desigualdad. Y esto obviamente se tiene que seguir investigando porque tenemos que seguir pensando las políticas, la educación, los proyectos de investigación para poder apoyar a esta población, sobre todo apoyar la disminución de las desigualdades acumuladas en el curso de vida de las personas, todo el impacto que tiene la enfermedad y los tratamientos ante el COVID, que además afortunadamente en muchas partes de México son gratuitos, pero sabemos también que en muchos hospitales privados han pauperizado aún más los hogares de las personas mayores. Entonces, tenemos que tener una perspectiva de curso de vida para poder ayudar también a las generaciones más jóvenes a enfrentar las secuelas del COVID. Tenemos que seguir pensando gerontológicamente en las personas mayores, pero desde el enfoque, obviamente, de la desigualdad acumulada, inmersa en nuestra propia dinámica, y tenemos que pensar, hemos pensado también mucho Telésforo y yo en la condición étnica en nuestro país y en las identidades sexogenéricas distintas que también ponen en distinto nivel de riesgo a la población LGBT. Y, por supuesto, pensar desde una perspectiva de género, porque esta resiliencia, como ayer bien mencionaba Rebecca Wong, no se construye en una pandemia, no se construye de un día para otro, se construye en el curso de vida de las personas. Y uno va enfrentando las desventajas y las ventajas que uno va teniendo y experimentando en el curso de la vida. Por eso es muy importante vincular la información de las encuestas, la información cuantitativa, como ayer también decía Latson, la información cuantitativa, pero también la cualitativa, para darnos cuenta de estos grandes desafíos que tenemos para el futuro. Y con esto cerraría mi presentación agradeciéndoles muchísimo la atención.
Muchas gracias, Veronica. We will be moving on to our last presentation on the panel, and that will be presented by Phil Cantu and Kyriakos Makidis.
Great, can y'all hear us?
We can.
Great, so Kobus is gonna give us a little bit of background on caregiving and caregivers during the pandemic, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about our Wave 10 data in Hispanic equities.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you, Jackie, for being part of our caregiving team, along with Sunshine Road and others. And we have brand new data on caregiving, which we got by telephone from caregivers only just recently. And we just finished. And then Philip is going to present those. Before that, I want to talk about a little bit of the background of what is happening in other countries in the last year or two with the studies of caregiving. And this is work done by Joanna Chiu, who is a medical student, second-year medical student working with us. She has an incredible job of really looking at most of the caregiving studies done. And while there are thousands of papers on older people during the caregiving pandemic, and there are only a few that are focused on caregivers. And a lot of the papers that have been published are from the lockdown period, the initial lockdown here, but also in Spain and Italy, the UK, and other European countries, really many countries in the world. So a lot of the findings about caregivers and about aging in general, they are about the experience during the lockdown, which was really a tough time. And things have really changed since that, you know, where we have been in a situation where people have a lot of freedoms in many countries. Not all of them, but anyway, part of Joanna's review, she looked at European countries and also the United States. But there are so many others, and I just published a paper today. I accepted a paper from New Zealand on caregivers, and tremendous paper really, because they had before and after data on a large sample. And we have before and after data on a smaller sample of Mexican Americans from the Hispanic ethnies. So there's been a lot of focus on, of course, psychological distress, mental health, isolation, loneliness, in studies of older people, and also how caregivers relate to the caregiver situation because of their isolation and loneliness, and which often leads to neglecting their own health. And studies in general show higher rates of distress during the lockdown and afterwards. But I must say that the rates are not real high. And people talk about resilience. And so do my colleagues in New Zealand talk about, you know, they had before and after data over 2 years, and they show, yeah, there were some influences, but they were minor in terms of anxiety and depression and so on. And but there are some caregivers who, you know, are influenced more than others. They report sleep problems, aches and pains, eating disorders, and loss of body weight. But this is a small minority of the experience out there. So what are some of the risk factors for caregiver burden? Well, you know, the usual factors are heightened during the pandemic, especially the lockdown. And of course, we know that it's more women who bear the responsibility, and they tend to also report the more stress and burden and also somatic symptoms than males in some of the work. And the caregiving of advanced dementia patients makes life more complicated and makes the situation of caring for them more complicated. And neuropsychiatric symptoms is judged by caregivers of their family members, which we have studied in our data, take their toll. Okay, so there's a lot of work on how the physical function and even cognitive function on caregivers in our data and others influence. Well, there's a lot of tolerance of problems, but when it comes to neuropsychiatric symptoms, we have shown and others have that they take their toll. There is some work on by one large study of people in nursing homes versus at home, caregivers, caregiving people at home versus nursing homes have more issues, as you might expect. And there are also financial issues people have to deal with. You know, they can't work because they have to take care of caregivers and so on. Now, there are also some positive things. The literature on caregiving in general, the last decade or so, has began looking at the positive aspects of caregiving and the influences of positive coping, personal qualities, resilience becomes an important factor, self-efficacy. So personal strengths of individuals, along with social resources around them, make a big difference. So during the pandemic, we have some evidence that some people are enjoying. They were enjoying the slower pace and enjoyed spending time with their family caregivers. This positive perspective on caregiving, I think we're finding also in our data, and Phil will tell us about it. Then, of course, people who are more educated, have more support around them, they report lower anxiety and depression. Now, looking at the future, we really need to see more studies who are looking at caregiving during the period after the lockdown in the United States, but also other countries. And there's some out there, and it's in the works now, it's being reviewed, and I get manuscript from the journal. And we are expecting that it's going to be a more positive experience and with less isolation and loneliness, where they're more likely to be able to visit with their children and grandchildren and family. And one thing that has become a kind of a norm in the care of older people and even the caregivers, telehealth. And we find it in our study too. So telehealth, again, like Zoom meetings, is telehealth here to stay. So something to think about. And I'm going to stop there and let Phil tell us about our data. First, I want to say a little bit about the study. We were about to, we began actually wave 10 of data collection for the Hispanic areas. We began in 93, 94, the first wave. The 10th wave was going to take place, and it did start taking place in January 2020. And we were expecting to interview 300 older people who were in their 90s and above, and 300 of their caregivers. And by March, middle March, we decided because of the pandemic, we have to stop. But we did get some data. We got some numbers from both 120 or so in each group. But we kept hoping that, after we stopped, we're going to be able to go back in the field in September. Well, September came along, 2020, and I think we couldn't do it. And then it was January. Anyway, and it was really spring of 2021. We decided we're going to do telephone calls. It was the only way. And we're only going to do that with caregivers because we didn't want to get telephone data from people in their 90s. We thought that would really be very difficult to do. And even with the caregivers, you know, it just, a lot of people don't answer their phones anymore. And so we had a hard time, but we got some useful data. And I'm going to let about it. Very preliminary data. We just finished the interviews a few weeks ago.
Great, yeah. So just so numbers, we had 131 people respond in 2020 with 122 informants. Then when we went back in 2021, we had 101 informants respond. 42 of the people we went to find were deceased, and we had got a deceased COVID protocol on them. In general, people were very old. They were 94 and older. Most of them were female. The informants were they were older adults themselves, ranging from 37 to all the way to 97. Most of them were female. And we happened to get 58 matched pairs of people who we interviewed in 2020 and interviewed in 2021. Now, in some of the some of the prior waves of the Hispanic EPIs, a lot of the caregivers were spouses, but by the 2021 sample, the vast majority of them were children, other family, and there was a bigger proportion of paid caregivers than had ever been in the past, and half of them were living together. And so there's 101 people, so everything is basically on the percentage scale. But in general, caregivers reported higher concern about the pandemic than the care recipients themselves. So when asked about how concerned they were about the pandemic, more of the care recipients replied that they were not concerned at all and replied that there had been very little impact on their life, while caregivers were the opposite. Caregivers were more likely to say that they were very concerned, especially relative to the people that they were caring for. And there was a lot of experience with COVID in this sample. Now, more caregivers reported having had a positive test at one point, but that's really kind of a skewed number because in our deceased protocol, we had 9 of the 42 deaths list COVID as the cause. In addition, in our NDI matches, there were an additional 9 people who we found as being deceased through NDI for COVID. So there were at least 18 COVID deaths in the 300 older adults who had survived into 2020. And vaccination rates were fairly high in the population that we were looking at, 87% of the caregivers and 86% of the care recipients. But among those who hadn't planned to who hadn't been vaccinated, most caregivers were planning to become vaccinated at some point, but most of the care recipients were not planning to get vaccinated at any time in the future. That was largely due to and the reason why they said they weren't planning on getting vaccinated in the future was due to the older person never leaving the house, feeling like it wasn't a good idea for them to get vaccinated since they were never around anybody else at all. And I'll also say that while people weren't necessarily planning on becoming vaccinated, they reported really high levels of adherence to social distancing. So there's a little bit of disconnect between the desire to get vaccinated and the desire to adhere to social distancing. 94% of people said that they social distance all the time in our sample. Cocos talked about some other potential stressors. There was a fair amount of caregiving for children at the same time as caregiving for older adults, but most caregivers didn't report that they had trouble providing care for their child during the time. And instead, people reported that it was much more emotionally difficult to deal with the type of care needed during the pandemic than it was financially difficult. And so, for all the research that talks about isolation and loneliness in the pandemic experience, we don't necessarily see that in our samples. People were very unlikely to report that they felt lonely during a typical week, or that they felt depressed during a typical week. And that's despite the fact that 86% of caregivers reported that the older person they were caring for had fewer visitors during the pandemic than they normally have during a typical week. And finally, we don't see a significant increase in depression over the two periods. The average CESD score in 2020 was 6.8 for the individuals that we had a matched pair for. It was 7.6 in the matched pair in 2021. So for all the research that has expressed there being really big negative effects on well-being, we're not necessarily seeing that among the caregivers in the Hispanic EPIs that we have two time periods for. So in conclusion, the care recipients in our sample were less concerned about COVID and reported a lower impact than the caregivers. Our preliminary analysis suggests that caregivers didn't have significant increases in depressive symptoms, but we still need to incorporate the cognition and the type of care that caregivers were dealing with over the time period to get a more holistic picture of what the caregiving experience was during the pandemic. And at least 18 of the survivors of the Hispanic EPIs, those 300 individuals that we sought out to interview in 2020, died during COVID. And it was one of the leading causes of death in our NDI match for 2020. And I anticipate that as mortality data becomes more available, we're going to see even more individuals in the Hispanic EPIs passing away from COVID-19. So is it for us. And I guess I'll kick it back over to Jackie for questions and answers.
Thank you, Phil and Cocos. We have time for one or two questions.
Brian. I think Brian asked about, do we have enough numbers to look at young caregivers versus old caregivers? And the question is, maybe we do. We can maybe have a kind of a multivariate regression where age is a variable, and then, but we have to bring in things like support systems, you know, who helps people, and the weaknesses and the comorbidities of the people, and their ability, employment status. So all of these variables we know. We can bring them into the story to explain whether they reveal information about age differences and how they handle.
Terrence has a question. Thank you, Cocos.
I had a question for all the presenters, just a general reflection question about how kind of focusing less on chronic disease inequalities and more on infectious disease inequalities, how that has challenged your assumptions and ways of thinking about health disparities.
I think that's a really good question, Terrence, because I think when we're talking about, so the Conference on Aging in the Americas, we talk about older adults. And older adults, the health conditions that we talk about are largely the chronic conditions. In infectious diseases, it seems like the impacts and the way that we have to study these the COVID-19 are more immediate, right? When we're talking about chronic conditions, we have models, we have understandings about long-term influences and long-term consequences of chronic conditions. But we don't necessarily have the appropriate models to talk about these shocks and these sort of very quick and immediate changes in aging and changes in health.
Rogelio or Arrow? Mark, would you like to comment?
I think that was very well said by Phil. Total agreement.
Okay, we have consensus.
Mark and Rogelio, can I ask y'all one question really quickly? It has to deal with the excess mortality in the traditional destinations versus the sort of paradoxical lower mortality in the new destinations for Latinos. Do you have any sense as to why that is? Is it and are there older Latinos in the new destinations? I mean, you would think that those people, those destinations would have more younger Latinos and be really kind of underrepresented in older Latinos.
Yep. So you look at the average age of death or the number of years that people had left of life, and you really find in the new destination areas where on average years of life on average were about 25 years of age that were left with the life table, compared to other places that it was 18, 20 or something like that. So that's one thing because of the usefulness of the population. And in those particular new destination areas, you do have an elderly population, but it's relatively small because these are mostly immigrants that have migrated in the last 20 years or so. So it's still a younger age range.
I would just, excuse me, I would just like to add to that is that the data that we presented is also aggregate data of the Latino population. We have to keep in mind that there's a lot of demographic heterogeneity within the Latino population by country of origin, by nativity status, by age of migration, definitely differences by gender. I will say that there has been recent evidence that has come out, particularly what comes to mind is a paper by Alicia Riley and colleagues from UCSF looking at excess mortality among Latinos in California. And they were able to get and use data looking at all types of by country of origin, by nativity status, whether they were essential workers, by education. And we know all of these factors also contribute to exposure, which ultimately leads to infection, hospitalization, and mortality. So for us, one of the main things, we're very interested in these types of factors that contribute to the Latino mortality, but we also recognize that there's large differences in state policies, how different government, local, federal report the data, and that is very, very difficult. It's an extreme limitation when we're trying to capture these trends that are rapidly changing. Thank you.
Jackie, you're muted.
The slide presentations for all of the panels will be posted on the CAA website. Is there any other lingering questions before we, I turn it back to Phil Cantu? Okay, Phil?
Great, thank you, Jackie. So we are just a little bit over time, but we're in pretty good time. I want to introduce our chair for our next panel. So as you know, University of Texas Medical Branch has a resource center for minority aging research called the Texas RCMAR. It is a traditional RCMAR focusing on aging research on Latinos. And we were lucky enough to be able to highlight some of the research that's going on at different resource centers, different RCMARs, part of the RCMAR network across the nation. And we have with us the director of the UCLA RCMAR Coordinating Center, Dr. Lourdes Guerrero. Dr. Guerrero, are you? I see you're sharing your screen. Can you hear us? Can we hear you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Lourdes.
Excellent. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation to present the excellent work of our RCMAR scientists. I am Lourdes Guerrero. I'm the co-director of the Resource Center for Minority Aging Coordinating Center at UCLA. Saludos from Southern California, from Aztlán, from the lands of the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples. For those of you that aren't aware, we have 18 RCMAR centers across the country. 10 of our RCMAR sites, as Phil has just mentioned, are traditional RCMAR centers, and 8 are new centers that are focused on Alzheimer's disease. All of our RCMARs are focused on decreasing health disparities by enhancing the diversity in the aging workforce, by mentoring promising scientists from underrepresented groups who conduct independent social and behavioral research on the health of older adults. So our overall goal is really to support the career trajectory of our underrepresented scientists to stay focused on the health and well-being of diverse older adults. The Resource Centers for Minority Aging Research, as a coordinating center, we create mechanisms for maintaining active involvement across all of the sites. We collect data on the accomplishments of all of our scientists in our network. But most importantly, we really try and connect our scientists to each other and to our larger network of senior faculty members across the country, and really try and support collaborations to increase the capacity for our scientists to disseminate their work and to continue their career trajectories. We're very proud of our RICMAR mentoring model, which includes pilot funding and a constellation of mentors and access to methodological experts. We're really proud of our scientists, and once a RICMAR scientist, always a RICMAR scientist is what we say. And so we welcome new scientists every year to the RICMAR, so look out for the call for pilots applications that usually come out around this time from our 18 sites and become part of our network. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from 4 of our fabulous RICMAR scientists. And in no particular order, I've listed them here in alpha order, but they won't be in this order as they present. But we're going to begin with Dr. Arevalo. Dr. Arevalo is a RICMAR scientist at the Michigan Center for Contextual Factors in Alzheimer's Disease, lovingly referred to as McFAD. Her research has a biopsychosocial approach. She combines theory, data, and methods from the social, behavioral, and biological sciences to understand human development, behavior, and health. She will be followed, her presentation will be followed by Dr. Escobar's presentation. Dr. Escobar is a RICMAR scientist at UT-RGV, and he is a member of our RICMAR Scientist Advisory Board. His interests in research are in mental health, aging, social work competency, and substance abuse. Following Dr. Escobar's presentation, we will hear from Dr. Angela Gutierrez. Dr. Gutierrez is a RICMAR scientist from our San Diego Alzheimer's site. She conducts research at the intersections of public health, medical sociology, and education. She employs quantitative, qualitative, and community-based participatory research methods to identify the factors that buffer or exacerbate health disparities among Latino older adults and other socially disadvantaged groups. Last but not least, we will hear from Dr. David Camacho. Dr. Camacho is a RICMAR scientist with the Columbia Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Alzheimer's Disease. His research centers around the physical and mental health of racial and ethnic and sexual minority older adults in the United States and Latin America. His research agenda includes gaining a deeper understanding of loneliness, depression, chronic pain, and cognitive impairment among diverse older adults. I'm looking forward to the panel today, and if you have any questions about becoming a RICMAR scientist, I hope to hear from you. So our first presenter will be Dr. Arevalo.
Good afternoon. So I just share my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for this kind invitation. I feel very honored to be here, sharing this time with all of you. And as Dr. Guerrero said, I will be presenting on my work with the McFAD Center. So let me put this. Let me. Okay. So I am a research scientist at the Michigan Center of Contextual Factors in Alzheimer's Disease. The MACFAD, as we call it, is an Alzheimer's disease focus center coordinated by the Resources Center for Minority Aging Research. And the MACFAD is a collaborative effort between the University of Michigan, Michigan State University, Wayne State University, and Eastern Michigan University. And the long terms of the MACFAD are to advance Alzheimer's disease and related dementia relevant to social and behavioral sciences research, particularly in underserved and underrepresented communities. And that's why most of our work in this, in my area, focuses on underserved populations. I will be presenting here the results of my pilot study that I got funded through the MACFAD. And my pilot study wanted to focus on the caregivers, but this particular population of caregivers is younger caregivers that we usually don't see much research in the caregiving literature. I decided to focus on this population because being part of the Cal State system, Cal State University system, we have here at Long Beach a great diversity of students with very diverse needs that frequently go overlooked. So my research interest was in this population that hasn't received too much research attention under the caregiver literature. And just to give some general information, according to the 2020 study from AARP, 5 million students enrolled are caregivers of an adult, or family member or friend. And many students, one of the big problems among students is that they don't see themselves as caregivers. Therefore, they overlooked all the effect of these extra activities in their lives, in their in their academic lives, and how that affects their, in turn, the mental and physical health. And as they don't see themselves as caregivers, many times they don't reach out for help. They don't let the instructors, the university know of their needs, and few colleges have services that address their particular needs. So as I mentioned before, caregiver research has focused mostly on spouses and older children of care recipients, but the younger population of caregivers, which is increasing in the last decades, hasn't received too much attention. Therefore, I wanted to assess here in my university, I wanted to assess the prevalence of caregiver of an adult in this population. I have my main goals in this study was to assess the prevalence and then to assess differences by race, ethnicity, taking advantage of the rich diversity of our student population. And the work among these younger adults, it's quite relevant because young adults are at a critical developmental stage, and most, as I mentioned before, most caregiver research is designed for the older caregiver population, and they may not capture many of their particular needs. So I'll present some preliminary data of my pilot study. I was able to gather a sample of 400 students. This was, I used a random sampling technique. I contacted randomly about 100 instructors from the college during the fall and during the summer of 2021. And they allow me to provide the survey I had designed to their students in their classes. So from these 400 students that I was able to recruit, I identified 25.5 who were identified themselves as a caregiver. Most of them were caregivers of an older adult, 90 students identified as such, and 26 students identified themselves as a caregiver of a minor person. Some of them had both, they were taking care of both an older adult and a minor, about 14 or 3.5%. And the most common illnesses from their care recipient were Alzheimer's, or people who had problems with confusion, dementia, memory problems. About 14% of the students who reported being caregivers, their care recipient had an illness related to Alzheimer's or memory problems. The other two frequent illnesses were diabetes and cancer. And in this table, I show general characteristics of the groups, and I'm comparing here to see the contrast between caregivers and non-caregivers. Overall, caregivers were older, about 2 years older than the non-caregivers. In terms of gender and race ethnicity, there were not significant differences. And I wanted, I listed here the Latino and Asian subgroups just to show you the diversity of our student body and our and this sample. As you can see, among Latino subgroups, the larger group was Mexican American, or those identified as Mexican or Chicano, with 35% among the caregivers. Followed by Central Americans, South Americans, and a small proportion of others who identified either as Puerto Rican, Cuban, or from Spain. Among Asian subgroups, we have the largest two groups were Filipino, about 30% in the general population, and the second one was Vietnamese. About 11% of the Asian subgroups of the Asian group. So as you can see, it's a very diverse group. In terms of financial differences, I didn't see any differences among caregivers or non-caregivers. In terms of outcomes, mental health outcomes and well-being, there were some significant differences between caregivers and non-caregivers. Basically, the caregivers had higher percentage of students who were looking for mental health services during the past month, or who were seeking for counseling services in the past month. There were significantly higher scores of anxiety among caregivers. And I also collected I used a measure of cognitive activities. This is a short, it's a 4-item measure from the PROMIS data measurement database. And this one captures, this is a self-report subjective perception of cognitive abilities. And these 4 items are phrased in a positive manner as capturing mostly memory and executive function abilities. And we see the difference was statistical at the 0.10 level. It didn't reach a significance less than 0.05. But we see that among caregivers, we see lower scores in the cognition scale. Then this table, taking advantage again of the diversity of this population, I wanted to compare these outcomes by race ethnicity between caregivers and non-caregivers. And we see in this table, we can see that the same differences that I just reported before, anxiety, well-being, and cognition levels are the caregivers are at a disadvantage in these two measurements, well-being and cognition. In terms of caregiving specific activities, let me see. I don't see the titles for this one. I might have lost them. So in these tables, these are the ADLs and IADLs among caregivers by race, ethnicity. And we see that there is overall no differences among these different racial ethnic groups of students providing ADLs and IADLs help to their care recipients. Overall, it's pretty similar. These two graphs represent challenges they have during providing services for their care recipients. The graph on the left is challenges, finding services, challenges, interacting with the medical services, and challenges overall trying to address the needs of their care recipients. The graph on the right is more of personal challenges, feeling overwhelmed, feeling overstressed, overworked, and in their role as a caregiver. And again, we don't see any racial or ethnic differences among the caregivers. And the last one, this last graph shows the services that they need. They reported on a list of 7 specific services that they might need. And on average, it was less than 2 services reported that they needed. But this may reflect simply that they are not aware of other services, and they don't so they don't check that as a need, and this amount in terms of service needs, I didn't find any racial or ethnic differences either. And so those are some preliminary analyses that I have completed with the data. I just finished collecting the data a couple of weeks ago. So I'm trying to put all these findings together. But what I see, I found the prevalence of caregiver students in our population was higher than I expected. I was aiming to find, based on previous reports about college students being caregivers, I was expecting to find about 10% or between 10 and 15% of caregivers, and I found higher percentages than that. From the findings I see, 2 things stand up is the higher levels of anxiety among the caregivers, and the higher perception of cognitive, subjective cognition that is lower compared to the non-caregivers, and that might reflect the stressors and the stressors and the activities that they need to provide to their care recipients that they might not have knowledge or of how to perform them, or knowledge of how to get support to complete those activities. And among the services that they were looking for when we ask about the services needs, one of the check that most of the caregivers mark was that they were looking, they would like to get support services, group support services, where they can learn more about how to take care of their adult care recipients. Overall, as I said, this is preliminary data, and I'm putting together all these findings and trying to get them ready for publication. But I think this is a very timely the collection of data, because we really don't know much about this hidden population. They are experiencing all these stressors, and they might be and at the same time, because of their higher education, most of these students in our college are first-time generation. So they have this overburden, but at the same time, they have this ability to maybe be the family. They can bring to the family the knowledge about how to care of this older family with problems that many times the family don't know how to handle. So when we're not assessing the needs of this special population, I feel like we're missing a great opportunity to improve the life of the care recipients and the life of the families who have to take care of an older adult, because these college students have the opportunity to be outside in the world, and they can bring this new knowledge, but we are not taking advantage of that link that can bring that can reduce these so in some form health disparities in the Latino and Asian communities, as we saw are the most disadvantaged in this population. So I'm happy to take any questions. As I said, it's preliminary data, but excited to see where this takes me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Arevalo. If folks have questions for her, please put them in the chat. Let's hear from Dr. Escobar.
Good afternoon. This is Dr. Escobar. I'm from UTRGV, way South Texas. Tip of between Mexico. Hi, Dr. Phillip. Let me see if I can share the screen here. Okay, can you see that? Okay, I'm in the wrong, hold on. I didn't change it to my first slide here. Okay. I did a pilot study on also on caregivers, Mexican-American caregivers here in South Texas. I don't have the PowerPoint because I had some difficulty last night. I did a PowerPoint for you all based on giving you information on Latinos and aging and what we discovered here. But I can talk about my pilot study also because it was quite difficult to finish it because I was originally supposed to do some focus groups here in South Texas, but I was not allowed to do face-to-face interviews because of the pandemic. That's when the pandemic started. And so I had to change my complete methodology into using either Zoom or telephone calls. It was very difficult to obtain the referrals that I was getting. I was working closely with the promotoras here in South Texas, who are healthcare workers that work in the colonias. They work with the Hispanic population. But before I can give you briefly, I just wanted to show you here in this map here. Here we are, UTRGV, way down the tip of South Texas. And we cover Rio Grande Valley is considered anywhere from Brownsville, which is the tip of South Texas, all the way to Starr County. So Rio Grande Valley consists of 4 counties: Cameron County, Hidalgo County, Starr County, and Willacy County. And those are the 4 counties involved in in this area. Just to give you an idea, we know that the aging population continues to live longer. So the projected population of Latinos by the year 2050 is a very high percentage. Therefore, in the lower Rio Grande Valley here, Right now, this is how we see here the age bracket of between 65 and 95 here. And as you can see, the projected growth is much greater as we approach 2050. So a little facts about the Latinos here in RGV. The population is about 1.4 million with about 93, which would be 93, almost 94% Latinos or Hispanics, Chicanos. However, I mean, I use simultaneously the different terms, whoever they want to relate to. People over the age of 65 is about 13.6%, with 1.5% of individuals with over 85 years old. Genders, difference in gender is males are make up 49% of the population, while females 51%. People speaking Spanish at home is almost 81%. Married with spouse present, 42.6%. Unemployment rate, 17.1 in the RGV, well above the state rate of 13%. And of course, we do have increased rates of poverty. There's a lot of poverty in this area. So there's a lot of opportunity for research. Now, facts on Latinos, Hispanics, we know that Hispanics 65 and over in the US will triple by 2050. And along with the population growth, Hispanics are more prone to develop Alzheimer's disease. 65% of the Hispanics are of Mexican origin. And I wanted to discuss very briefly the UCLA Field School of Public Health study done by Dr. Horvath in 2016, which he found that Latinos age at a slower rate than other ethnicities, and they live longer despite increased rates of diabetes and other diseases. The life expectancy is 3 years, an average of 3 years longer. So it's 82 versus 79 for other Caucasians. And healthy Latinos face a lower risk of death than other racial groups. Now, what it did, Dr. Horvath is a professor, oh, that's a typo, I apologize, professor of biostatistics. He used several biomarkers, including an epigenetic clock to track an epigenetic shift in the genome that links to aging. And he analyzed DNA samples of about 6,000 individuals from 7 different ethnicities, including the Hispanic. And he discovered that the blood of Latinos age more slowly than all other groups involved in the study. So, of course, his findings supported that genetic or environmental factors are linked to ethnicity may influence how quickly a person ages and how long they live. So what are the challenges for us here in the RGV with that kind of statistics, knowing that our aged population is living longer? So in my study, I was supposed to have about 60 to 80 caregivers if I had done the way I had submitted my proposal. But because of the pandemic, I had to change my methodology, as I mentioned. So now I had to do phone calls. Well, it was very difficult to obtain the phone calls because, number one, people didn't know who I was. And when I would make the phone calls, they wouldn't answer my phone calls. And I hated to be persistent with them. Finally, they would answer, and then I would introduce myself, and I would tell them what my study was about to elicit some kind of cooperation, or not cooperation, but participation in the study. I was able to interview 15 caregivers. They were all female, and they were within the age range of 28 to the oldest one was a 78-year-old woman. And about 9 of those 15 had taken care of family members. And the other 6 were like home providers that were taking care of Alzheimer's patients, okay? But with the elderly growing, living longer, then the values of familismo comes into place, where the family members are expected to take care of the elderly at home. So that increases the family burden and issues for the family. And what I found in the 15 caregivers that I interviewed, mind you, this was by telephone, is that there was a high, I was trying to measure spirituality. I was trying to measure burden of care. And then also, how did they take care of themselves, do some self-care? And what I found is that extreme high levels of spirituality where they believed in a higher power, whether it be God or a higher power, that would give them the strength to continue caring for their loved one. And as far as the burden scale, what I found in there, that there were high, as Dr. Arevalos indicated in her study, there were high levels of depression and anxiety for the caregivers. And then on the self-care, all 15 of them really did very, very little to take care of themselves. They would focus the care of their loved one or of the individual that they were supposed to take care. So it was interesting that they would sort of like, if you're talking in substance use terms, very codependent, because they're thinking of their loved one first and then negating their own self-care. Now, what makes it even challenging here in the Rio Grande is there's a lack of financial resources to obtain proper health. There's high rates of people purchasing medications in Mexico as opposed to here because of lack of insurance or lack of financial resources. And there's a lot of treatment, and they use a lot, sometimes treatment of what we call hierberias, folk medicine. They would rather go see a curandero instead of seeing a physician. So in my study, I had to gain trust by them. So I had to do a lot, the value of confianza. They had to, being that most of them didn't have Zoom so I could see them, they were just talking to the stranger over the phone. So a lot of what I did was basically initially what we call pláticas with them to allay some of their concerns, to really try to establish a therapeutic relationship with them so that they could give me the information that I was needing. So in the pláticas, I would ask them the questions that I wanted on each of these 3 surveys that I was taking. And once they trusted me, the interesting thing that I found during the interviews is that they really wanted to talk and they really shared a lot of information. I think they felt that, hey, someone is listening to me. With the high levels of stress that they had and or anxiety, I think they really appreciated the fact that someone was listening to all the issues that they had in taking care of their loved one. And of course, also the concept, the value, Mexican-American value of personalismo, where there's a personal touch to allow them to feel at ease. And the one thing that I took out of that is that they themselves would give me referrals because I had such a limited number. I had a lot of referrals, but when I would make the telephone calls, people wouldn't respond back. For the most part, they would help me because they would give me, oh, I have a comadre, I have a friend that may be interested in participating in your study. So I'm gonna go ahead and give him your number. I'm gonna tell him what you're doing. And invariably they would, once I would call them. But unfortunately, my end was very little. I only had 15 people, but it was a very interesting study. I got a lot of good information from the caregivers that I interviewed. And once that I would start talking to them, they would give me a wealth of information about their experiences as a caregiver. So I'm finalizing my data. These are preliminary findings that I'm sharing with you, but it was a good study, I think. I wish I would have had a larger number, and the hope is that eventually we can do a larger scale of caregivers. And that's it. It covered from, I did studies in Cameron County, Hidalgo County, and Webb County, which is closer to, in Laredo, which is not considered Rio Grande Valley, but it's upper west of in the border, Laredo. And that's it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Escobar. Again, if you have any questions for him, please put them in the chat. He can address those there. We have two more presentations. We have two more presentations from our RICMAR scientists, Dr. Gutierrez and Dr. Camacho. I think given the time, we'll just have them go back to back. And again, you can ask your questions to them in the chat. Dr. Gutierrez.
Angela, you're muted.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes todos. Gracias por estar aquí. So today I'm excited because I'll be sharing some of my research with you. And this talk is entitled Profiles of Social Coping Resources Among Latinx Adults, Implications for Depressive Symptoms and Self-Rated General Health. And to briefly provide some background, a large body of health disparities research focuses on the different risk factors contributing to racial and ethnic disparities in health. Another large body of research has shown the value of coping. Within the coping research, a large portion of it has focused on coping styles. For example, adaptive coping compared with maladaptive coping, problem-focused coping compared with emotion-focused coping, or coping with, for example, chronic pain or coping with cancer. And while these are helpful in their own ways, there is an entire other area of research that has focused on coping resources. So when thinking of resilience, it's important to understand coping resources. These are the tools that individuals draw on to respond to the challenges that they face across the life course. Coping resources can be personal resources like mastery and self-esteem. They can be social resources like social support, and that's the focus of today's talk, or they can be health behaviors. And although the coping literature is large, several gaps still remain, particularly among the Latinx population. For example, a first gap that I see is that most of the coping literature among Latinx adults focuses on coping styles, and it doesn't tap into the variations in coping resources that are accessible. And ultimately, that really limits our ability to identify under-resourced groups. A second gap in the research literature is that among studies that do examine coping resources among Latinx adults, most focus on one coping resource at a time. For example, spiritual coping. And the reality is that coping is a complex behavior, and as individuals, we draw on more than one coping style or more than one coping resource to respond to the different adversities that we face across the life course. For that reason, it's important to capture coping resources in their naturally occurring and multidimensional or complex state. And finally, a third gap is that among this area of research, studies typically examine a single health outcome at a time. In the studies where multiple health outcomes are assessed, both are either mental or physical health outcomes, which can increase the risk of misclassification bias or overestimating who is well. And so based on these gaps in the literature, what I did specifically to address gap 1 and gap 2 is I used latent class analysis to identify social coping profiles based on patterns across 7 distinct social factors. By applying latent class analysis, we're able to observe coping resources in their naturally occurring and complex state instead of studying each resource in an isolated state. And what I did is I looked at social resources that are likely to promote health. These are positive social coping resources. And I also recognize that not all social interactions are positive. So I considered the role of 3 factors that may undermine health. These are negative family support, medical mistrust, and loneliness. And basically, results from that study were part of a book chapter from the collection that Jackie and colleagues put together and came out recently. And in 1 or 2 slides, I'll briefly summarize the relevant key findings as they're the foundation for the study I'll be focusing on. So basically, results from that study indicate that there are 4 distinct coping profiles among this sample of Latinx adults. And I'll go ahead and provide a very high-level summary of the 4 coping profiles. Members of Class 1, or those in Class 1, are characterized by having high positive social resources. Members of Class 2 are characterized by having frequent yet negative family relations. Members of Class 3 are characterized by having positive family resources and high medical mistrust. And finally, members of Class 4 are characterized by having frequent yet negative family relations and high medical mistrust. In terms of some of the nuances within and across the classes, I've created this summary table to identify a few different patterns. For example, members of Class 1 and members of Class 3 have high levels of all or most of the positive social resources. And we can also see that family interaction was high across all 4 of the distinct classes. However, those in Class 1 and Class 3 experienced positive family support, while those in Class 2 and Class 4 experienced negative family support. Here we can also see that those in Class 3 and Class 4 reported high levels of medical mistrust. And finally, I want to bring attention to members of Class 4. Members of Class 4 have low levels of positive family support, low levels of family pride, and low levels of friend social support. They also have high levels of frequent yet negative family interactions and medical mistrust. So now that we have a general overview of what these distinct profiles look like, I wanted to really know if there are any combinations of social coping factors that are linked with better or worse health outcomes. And so that's basically where the new study comes in. And what I did is I looked at the relationship between each coping profile and 2 indicators of well-being. These were depressive symptoms and self-rated general health. To do this, I used a disabilities data set with an analytic sample of 605 Latinx adults, and I used multivariable linear regression for the analysis. To measure depressive symptoms, I used the CESD, and self-rated general health was measured using the RAND 36-item health survey general health subscale. So now jumping into the results. What I did is I looked at the mean depressive symptom scores for each of the coping profiles. High scores indicate more depressive symptomatology. I then used multivariate linear regression that controlled for demographic characteristics and 2 health conditions. The numbers above each of these columns represent whether the class is statistically different from other classes. And overall, results suggest that members of Class 4 have significantly higher depressive symptom scores than members of all other classes. What I did next is I ran the same analysis, but this time looking at mean self-rated for general health. Once again, higher self-rated general health scores indicate worse self-rated general health. And overall, findings suggest that members of Class 4 have significantly worse self-rated general health scores than members of Class 1 and members of Class 3. So in terms of putting it all together, what this means, I found that classes low on positive social resources fared poorly on both health outcomes. For example, if we think back to members of Class 4, members of Class 4 had the lowest levels of positive social resources. They also fared worse off than other classes on both indicators of well-being. On the other hand, we have members of Class 1. Those in Class 1 fared well on the self-rated general health outcome, but had significantly more depressive symptoms than those in class 2. Overall, these findings suggest that these social coping profiles are differentially associated with depressive symptoms and self-rated general health. And more specifically, having high positive social coping resources may be more protective for general health than for mental health. And in thinking of next steps for this work, I received funding from the San Diego AD RICMAR to continue examining the role of psychosocial factors among Latinx adults. And in this work, I will be looking at stress exposure and cognition among older Latinx adults, the mediating and moderating role of psychosocial factors. I would also like to thank Dr. Maria Aranda, who is here with us today, for serving as my project mentor, and Dr. Linda McEvoy for serving as my center mentor. And in this RICMAR work, I will be looking at the direct relationship between stress exposure and cognitive function. And I will also be looking at the mediating and moderating role of psychosocial factors in the relationship between stress exposure and cognitive function. And to do this, I will be using the Health in Retirement study. So I know that I really breezed through this, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of the panel. And ultimately, I just want to thank the ICA leadership team and the San Diego AD RICMAR and my generous mentors. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Please ask Angela your questions through the chat. And our next presenter, please.
Sorry. Hello, everybody. It seems like I may have 8 minutes or so left.
You've got 12 minutes.
15.
Oh, yeah,
all right.
Well, there's 3:10 to give room time for questions.
It's all good. I mean, I'll take out the maybe details that are not so important. So my name is David Camacho. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. I am a social worker, so I'm in school social work at this point. Briefly touching on my relationship with the RICMAR centers, I obtained some pilot funding for the RICMAR Center at Columbia. This is the title of the RICMAR project. We're basically looking at the relationship of chronic pain and loneliness and how these two common factors contribute to cognitive changes over diverse groups of older adults. Basically, the idea here is that, yes, we've established some links between chronic pain, loneliness, and cognitive functioning, but these have been understudied among African-American and Latino communities. So we're primarily looking at the role of minority stress as well. And we are conducting a qualitative interviews to really get at explanatory models of a loneliness and chronic pain, particularly the role of minority stress, how it shapes these experiences. I will make a quick plug for this because I think I'm speaking to the choir. I'm currently recruiting for my qualitative study. We're recruiting online nationwide, and we are conducting a study with older Latinx individuals, 60 years and older. And in this case, I say on purpose Latinx to include sexual and gender minorities. Anybody who speaks English and Spanish is welcome. We're doing this over the phone. We have been working with community champions to recruit and connect to individuals. So if anybody, I'm more than happy to send this out to the group. Please send them my way. But for today's presentation, what I'm really going to be focusing on is a current study that I'm involved in Puerto Rico. We're looking at coping with the impact of COVID-19, looking at older adults living in Puerto Rico. This is a collaboration that I'm currently working with a couple of mentors, one of them being Dr. Burnett. And this is a collaboration between Columbia University, Virginia Commonwealth, University of Pittsburgh, and now myself at Maryland. Brief overview, skipping this outline. I don't think I need to talk much about the impact of COVID-19. Everybody here is very much informed. We know that this is a worldwide pandemic, has led to, unfortunately, many, many deaths, unnecessary deaths, I would say. And we have experienced a lot of health and healthcare challenges, depression, anxiety, social isolation, and loneliness. As a social worker, it's very important. One of our values is to help to reduce the idea or the concept of suffering particularly among marginalized communities, and that includes older adults, individuals in Latin America, and those living in poverty. And unfortunately, many individuals experience all three intersecting problems. For today's presentation, what I'm focusing on is a little bit of our qualitative analysis related to how our older adults in Puerto Rico, living in Puerto Rico, coping with COVID-19. And though, the importance of coping, all of you are probably very, very well familiar with the importance of coping, Lazarus and Folkman, the importance of paying attention to how people appraise a possible threat. And also that coping strategies, the way people cope with stress, is shaped by context and, not surprisingly, culture. These are understanding coping as an important piece in order to develop supportive health interventions, particularly for mental health. And unfortunately, although there is some work examining coping strategies, a lot of that work has focused in the mainland US, has excluded monolingual Spanish speakers or primarily Spanish speakers. And as much as we understand in our review, there hasn't been much qualitative work with older Puerto Ricans. So this is an opportunity to advocate and to explore their experiences. I would be amiss if I don't talk about the parallel pandemics as some of the authors here. I'm gonna skip over what I mean by this. This is specifically Garcia et al. I know several of you authors are here, so please don't kill me if I misrepresent, but we need to understand COVID-19 from not just as a standalone pandemic, but a parallel pandemic, along with political instability on the island of Puerto Rico, economic crisis, a lot of people living in poverty. We're thinking about demographic changes, a lot of older adults, and a lot of the younger individuals who may serve as supports are actually leaving the island. We must acknowledge the history of environmental challenges, including hurricanes and earthquakes, and ultimately the challenges in terms of the healthcare infrastructure. Although there are about 60 plus or so hospitals on the island, I believe, a lot of them are concentrated in major cities. So for those individuals living in rural areas, they have difficulty in accessing care. And not surprisingly, a lot of older adults have high numbers of chronic conditions. The data I'll be talking about comes from a current study on knowledge, attitudes, and practices in Puerto Rico. I'm not going to go into the details. Basically, we're working with community agencies to recruit and do phone interviews with older adults living in the community. We are working with PhD students from universities in Puerto Rico who are master level social workers, fluent Spanish speakers, and native Puerto Ricans for the most part. We definitely engage in a thorough training to include data collection, how to work through standardized assessment, and also trauma-informed principles, older adults, how to work with older adults, and processing individual reflexivity is an important piece of this. More specific to this project, I'm talking about, we were looking particularly at 3 items that explored how people spent time, how they coped, what they identified as difficult aspects of COVID, and what they have learned from this experience of living through the challenge of COVID. I didn't put the exact questions up here because at the end of the day, when we do qualitative work, the initial questions are only a starting point. What people express are not limited by just what is asked. They basically give you a narrative, which is very typical, again, in qualitative work. We conducted a thematic analysis. These transcriptions or these narratives were transcribed, translated for our English-speaking group members. And the analysis is an ongoing iterative process. I must say this is a work in progress. The team, in terms of the team's role, I must say that there's a special emphasis on reflexivity, paying attention to our own unique identities, experiences as insiders and outsiders, our own training, and how it shapes our perspectives and analysis and ultimately interpretation of the data. So with that said, very simple, we looked at 51 individuals from this data so far. What I want to highlight here is that a lot of our participants lived in poverty, and we have high rates of suicide, relatively high rates of suicidal ideation. On the right side, you see 12%. Loneliness was very, very common in this sample. Self-rated health, half of them had fair or poor health, and almost 70% reported dissatisfied or feeling very dissatisfied with life satisfaction. And I put this life satisfaction status in here as part of the theme that we have going on in this conference, looking at resilience and subjective well-being overall. So one of the initial findings in thinking about Lazarus and Folkman, it's important to pay attention to how people appraise the possible threat of COVID. Here, the ultimate idea here is that individuals identified COVID as a threat to health and well-being. Now, I must point out that this may seem no duh. However, what's important here is what people didn't say at the same time. There was nobody saying that this was fake news. Nobody was saying that this is not true, that this is not going to affect them. So the great majority, if not all individuals, identified that this was a threat to their health and well-being. And we could see this by the way that individuals were encouraging others to follow the rules, not get infected, get vaccinated if possible. In addition, the second quote there, it's interesting how previous experiences related to crises shaped the way they saw COVID as a threat, as a possible, another barrier to overcome. This will pass. Try to stay positive in the face of situations. And as I am a survivor in Maria, I know that things will get better. So again, we're paying attention to how context shapes the perspectives and experiences and appraisal of COVID. Not surprisingly, a lot of individuals talk about the challenges, and some of those challenges included the separation and distancing from family, not just social isolation and loneliness, but the actual family loneliness. And this being very much in contrast to cultural values. One of the challenges for this individual was not being affectionate with other people. There were several people reporting this. It's not just the physical distance, the inability to touch people, to kiss and hug friends. It's not who we really are. So at the end of the day, we think about suffering, this is really getting at the core of the human aspect of who these individuals are. Similarly, there was a lot of report of mood, grief and loss, stress. What I want to point out here, though, is that a lot of these, for example, grief and loss, there are a lot of established cultural behaviors, decorum in terms of what to do in certain experiences. There have been a lot of deaths, undoubtedly, but how people are grieving is being halted or modified because of social distancing. So being far away from family who have experienced vicissitudes and one has not been able to be there. Social support is a commonly accepted perspective, but that has been challenged or has been a challenge as a result of social distancing. The other part is that when we think about older adults, a lot of older adults as they get older, or individuals as we get older, our lives become a lot more routinized. And here for this individual points out that changes in routine were really difficult, almost traumatizing. Life changed dramatically, not being able to get together with family. We had a routine at 3 to 4 p.m. They would meet up, buy cookies or get cookies, bring coffee, and they couldn't do that anymore. And this is important because as a younger adult, I may consider this to be a mundane, not important factor, but given from an older adult perspective, these are important things to consider. Things that we may perceive as not important could be very, very important in the routines for these individuals. In terms specifically coping, I think a previous presenter just mentioned, it's hardly ever just one type of coping. Individuals embrace multiple forms of coping. There was a lot of keeping busy, doing busy work, working with plants, working with crafts. And this individual was interesting. This person went fishing, which is very unique or specific to the context being in Puerto Rico and this person being a fisherman. Similarly, cognitively, sometimes it's not to think too much about this issue. Keep busy. But the third one also exemplifies some of the cultural perspectives, religious ways of coping. I read the Bible a lot and watch television. In the afternoon, I have to point out, not surprisingly, the novela is important. They have soap operas that I do not miss. I'm very much a homebody. But of course, the most effective has been to read the Bible, of course. So I think there's a lot of cultural nuances that we have to pay attention here and how, again, coping mechanisms are shaped by context and culture. Finally, in terms of what they learned in lessons, relationships, there was a lot of discussion about paying attention, valuing emotional relationships, the love, kindness, human contact, and being free. These descriptions are very much in line with the social emotional sensitivity theory, thinking about older adults, emphasis on emotional quality of relationships versus the number of quality of relationships. Similarly, we think of the threat of loneliness was an important factor that was identified by these individuals. And I highlight this, a lot of this has to do also with my own work with loneliness. There's a limited understanding of the experience of loneliness among diverse groups of older Latinx individuals. So the fact that they identify this as an important threat, I think is an important finding. The first one basically says, in the face of loneliness, I have come to reflect on many things. One, as a person learns to be more kind and sensitive with the people. So there's, again, this emphasis on emotions, on building those connections, maintaining the relationships, being sensitive to others. And lastly here, one should prepare ourselves for when loneliness arrives in our lives. I managed to learn to live with loneliness as I was not used to that. So given all the literature that is available in other groups about the impact of loneliness, the detrimental effects, I think it's important for us to pay more attention to loneliness and how older Latinx individuals can cope, including those in Puerto Rico. Finally, in terms of the implications, I have to acknowledge that the threat of COVID is not very well defined. It's very well changed by individual health status, resources, where they live in the city. I think Garcia, you talk about, for example, Vieques being almost an isolated state within Puerto Rico itself. But ultimately, the key takeaway here is that culture and contextual factors shape appraisals and how people cope. In line with the concept of this conference, we think about resilience, and we have to highlight the historical, the strength of individuals in the sample to overcome chronic and novel challenges to their well-being. And ultimately, in terms of research and practice, we think about, well, a further step once we collect more data is to explore how different types of coping strategies relate to health outcomes. That includes loneliness, knowledge, attitudes, and practices. And I'll be a little hesitant to say life satisfaction, considering that I think that life satisfaction is pretty stable here. We do have a measure of happiness. We would probably look at that as a more important piece. And finally, the development of interventions. Findings from this study will support or inform interventions related to mental health as a whole, thinking about how people cope and improving, hopefully supporting the implementation of effective coping strategies. And that's pretty much what I have. I think I kept it under 10 minutes, right?
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our RICMAR scientists. Thank you to the audience for being here with us. If you have any questions for them, feel free to put them in the chat. And back to you, Phil. Thank you.
Yeah. So if anybody has any questions, I had a couple asked in the chat, but they've been responding to in the chat. So if anybody else has any questions, we are running just a little behind, so I think we'll take just a quick 2-minute break, and then at 3:10 we will come back together to start our awards ceremony and memorial service. So 3:10, 2 minutes, everybody.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you, and thank you for the panelists. It's really, really amazing work. No, that's the consensus voting. Oh, okay. 2 minutes.
Cocos, how are you doing?
Hey, Ben, I didn't know you were there, man.
Yeah, I've been there the whole time. I just haven't had my picture on because it shouldn't be on, but I've been here the whole time.
I'm glad. I'm glad, man. I think it's going well. Thank you for your part. Everybody else. I need to run, however.
Sure.
For a minute. I'll be back. We're going to do that consensus. Thank you.
Terrence?
Yes.
Great. So I guess you could share your first slide, and then we can have Dr. Vega start the memorial service.
And I'll say something.
And then Kokos will say something.
Very good.
Are you ready to begin right now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Terrence, you have something to say?
Yes. Thank you all. Before we get into our poster award presentation, we have a couple of eminent scholars who would like to offer a brief memorial for Professor Stephen Wallace. We're going to begin with William Vega, who is currently at Florida International University. Please, go ahead.
Yes, well, it's certainly my pleasure to be discussing someone as critically important to so many of our lives as Steve was. He was such a vital personality, such a vital human being, that his loss, not just because he was, it was a premature loss, but because he was such a really important part of all of our lives. He was just vivid in our lives and still is. I think that to characterize him is really to characterize the features of the best possible representation of what you can be as a, not just a scholar, but a mentor and a good citizen in this world, and someone who put the public health issues of really the entire society first and foremost in his life. I mean, he lived it every day. And he was a very, he was very adventurous and yet very low key. So it's very interesting contrast of personality styles, because on the one hand, he was an exemplar of leadership, low key leadership that was very effective, very detail oriented. Yet on the other hand, he used to ride his bicycle from Culver City to UCLA every day in very dangerous traffic. I would never do it. And I used to ride motorcycles. I wouldn't do that. And he got hit a couple of times on motorcycles, on his bicycle, and was thrown over vehicles and hospitalized. And yet he never gave up. He still kept doing it and stayed at it. So it gives you a sense of the personality and tenaciousness that he had as he approached life and all of his tasks, his important tasks in life. So I just, I want you to understand the kind of style of personality that he had. And he was so personable, and that made him such an effective mentor, because I think more than anything else, I'm sure as everyone recalls, his mentorship was just absolutely unduplicated, I believe. I've never seen anything like his ability to help so many people. And I don't just mean students and postdocs, which of course he did, and did with relentless energy and patience, but I also mean even with, faculty members themselves, because many, especially Latino faculty members who would be having problems at UCLA or wherever they happen to be, he was always an open house counselor, willing to talk with people and to assist them and give them moral support and give them whatever, instruction he could give them of how to deal with their situation, and give them even possibly openings and different kinds of opportunities. I think that understanding that kind of honesty, understanding that kind of loyalty is something that, was unique to him, because, he came up in a world where he knew about the Latino experience. I mean, he didn't have to learn about it from books or from health disparities literature. He grew up with it, and he understood it. He lived in the communities that were affected, and he knew the situation. So he came at it from a perspective of very, very much of humility in his approach to academics. He wasn't an ego-centered individual. He wasn't a boisterous individual. He led by example. And I think when I look at him and I remember our work together, and specifically such odd things that occurred, as always do in everyone's life, as I remember being at a National Academy of Medicine meeting with Steve, and I was sitting at the meeting with him. And I remember that he got a telephone, message that the previous director of the California Interview Survey had just dropped dead at the podium when he was delivering a talk, and he turns around to me and tells me the story in shock. And now, when the same thing more or less happened to Steve, it's our turn to be absolutely shocked and stunned, as he was. And of course, he became the replacement for that individual, and he took on the enormous task of the California Interview Survey and carrying it forward, and did it flawlessly, and of course did many other things in the center as well. So I think that, you know, what we're talking about here is someone that checks all the boxes, you know, of what we would hope, you know, we would all be able to personify in terms of the characteristics of really top leadership, which had no flailings. I mean, when I worked with him, he was obviously always ready to stand up and do the best possible job. And he was very good at incisive understanding of how you push epidemiologic information and general information from surveys into policy-related statements. And most of us still, I think, struggle with that because we weren't brought up necessarily as policy experts. And he had a certain knack and ability to penetrate that world and to develop his ideas that became very concisely focused in messaging. So I think even there, I think he gave us so much, you know, to go on and to continue struggling forward and get the message that, you know, we need to learn how to not just do research, but how to turn it into action items and messaging that begins to change minds and begins to provoke action. So I think all those areas are things that, you know, I feel, you know, really underscore, you know, what he gave us. But more than anything else, I really went on the personal side, I want to say that he just was such a wonderful individual to know. And he was always receptive, always open, always warm, and always available. And I don't know how he did it, given the complexity and the density, you know, of the obligations that he took on. But that just demonstrates for you what leadership is all about. Now, I'll turn it over for any other comments or that people might have.
Yeah, well, thank you, Bill. A lot of what you said, of course, I agree with, and I remember very much the Steve you described. I met Steve in 1984, actually. He was a graduate student. So he invited me to a session at a conference, and then we became friends ever since. I always appreciated, even at an early age, his emphasis on people of color and also the more applied version of what we do. You know, on occasions, 3 or 4 times when I was asked to write a chapter about the health of minorities or Hispanics, I got to a point where I needed Steve to fight to finish it because he would provide the policy, the social policy, health policy perspective, and also include a junior colleague, which I also appreciated. I have so many fond memories of this guy, you know, and I'm still shocked that we lost him. I have so many fond memories because I've met him in LA or at conferences once or twice a year, and I have had so much good food with him. He was great to go to dinner with, and he loved great restaurants, and we always enjoyed that, and I miss that. I miss going to LA, because I miss going to LA period, because we're not able to, but I miss the man so much. He was such an influence on me and was such an influence on our field. And I'm honoring him personally. I asked Lourdes Guerrero and Jackie Torres, who was a student, and Lourdes, of course, took over the coordinating center of the RICMAR, to edit a special issue of the Journal of Aging and Health to honor Steve. And I think they were looking at papers by his students and others from the RICMARs on health access to healthcare and a focus on people of color. So we're very excited about that, and I thank Lourdes this year and Jackie, who is not, for leading that effort. Thank you.
Terrence?
Jackie?
Just a few additional comments. Steve was a giant, as we all know, in minority aging. He was also a very active member of our CAA advisory group. And we were born actually the same year. So we always shared those cohort experiences, but he's actually part of my family because his graduate work was done with Carol Estes, a close colleague of mine from UCSF. And it's hard to describe all of the contributions he's made, as Cocos and Bill have mentioned, but more importantly, he was just a mentor to everyone, and incredibly generous with his time, his thoughtfulness. I mean, there's just not enough to describe how much he made a contribution to our lives. And I'm still processing his death. I really appreciate many of those who are with us today and others who have been sort of helping get through this, because it has been shocking, and I will miss him. All of his leadership and scholarship, we shared so much, and he had so much more to give. So let me stop there. Thank you, Terrence.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. So I think we'll move forward to the poster awards presentation. Before we announce the awards, I want to acknowledge a lot of people that were involved to get this off the ground. If you want to talk about resilience, you should talk about doing a virtual poster session. We, as a planning committee, came up with this crazy idea, and Phil Cantu and his colleagues at UTMB made this happen technically. And in addition, I want to thank my co-chair, Adriana Reyes from Cornell University. She was extremely helpful at all steps of the process in terms of organizing and processing all the submissions and communicating with all the poster presenters. And then we have several judges, poster judges, who evaluated all of the poster submissions. We had submissions from across the United States and Mexico, representing a wide range of disciplines related to gerontology, social gerontology, sociology, psychology, public health, medicine, and so on. Robin Brown from the University of Kentucky, Brian Downer from UTMB, Mariana Lopez Ortega from the Mexican National Institute of Geriatrics, Joseph Saenz from USC, Nelly Salgado de Schneider from UT Austin, and Laura Upanex from Baylor University. They all devoted their time during a pandemic to judge, not only judge our posters, but to provide extra written feedback because this was done in a virtual sense. And we wanted to continue the tradition that ICA has established over time of providing mentorship to junior scholars who are involved in our poster session. So thank you all, Phil, co-chairs, judges, for all of your work. It's much appreciated. We couldn't have done this without you. Thank you. And now what we're all waiting for, the poster winners. Third place is a submission from Chinadu Onwudebe. I hope I said that correctly. Diabetes complications and pain among Mexican Americans age 75 and older. Third place, congratulations. Second place is a submission by Xia-Ying Yu. I hope I said that correctly as well. Assessing racial ethnic disparities in incident depression among older HIV-infected and uninfected Medicare enrollees. Second place, congratulations. And finally, first place, a submission from Ya-Lin Kang, religious attendance and cognitive impairment incidents, a cohort study of Mexican-American older adults. I want to be honest or clear here. I did not judge this. It's research on religion, and this would not be an ICA conference if I did not take a moment to shame you all for not talking about religion more in this conference on resilience in Latino populations and Mexican populations. But that's it. First place. Thank you all. I posted the link to all the posters in the chat, so please take a few minutes to take a look at the poster winners and the other posters. They were all very good submissions, and we had to slice the scoring pretty thin in order to come up with the top posters. So those that didn't place in the top 3 are still very good, and highly recommend that you all take a look. And if you have time, take a moment to send some comments if something comes to mind to our young investigators to help them, you know, as they develop their work for publication. Thank you all.
Before we move on to the consensus building session, I do want to take a second to thank Jackie for her leadership on putting this conference together. She organizes these ICAA calls every month and make sure that we have places to meet at every major national conference. And she makes this happen. So I really want to thank Jackie for all of her hard work throughout the year. I want to thank Terrence and Adriana in particular for organizing our poster session and making sure that this happened for our emerging scholars. I think this is one of the most, I think our emerging scholars program is the most important thing that we do as the ICAA. I want to thank Vero and Cocos and Rogelio for all of their help in organizing this. And I want to thank Flavia and Stephanie for our consensus building session that's still coming. But I want everyone who's a part of the ICAA, everyone who's been able to enjoy this conference. So there's been a lot of work from a lot of people for a long time, and that we have this is truly a labor of love. And I'm so happy with the sessions that we've had over the past 2 days. And I think, you know, the leadership that we have at the top really makes for our emerging scholars and everyone throughout our organization better. So Jackie, thank you so much. Cocos, Rogelio, Veronica, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to Phil also. Tremendous. Yeah.
Cool. So then I think we've got another sort of 3-minute lull before we start the consensus building session. If anybody needs to take a quick break, feel free. Flavia, will you explain what's going to happen in the consensus building session? Or Stephanie?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So hello, everyone. We're really looking forward to continue working with you. We're going to have a relatively short consensus building session. It's very important, your input, as we plan also not only like the next installments, but also like for publications that we have that result as materials that we developed during this conference series. If you could stick around, we're going to ask your input on 3 questions, and we are going to summarize these 3 points that are relevant for the development of the next installment as well. So we'll be back soon, and we are going to go into breakout rooms to answer these 3 questions and then come back to the final moments of our conference.
Yeah. So our room will be here.
You're here.
Yeah, I'll be here. Yeah.
Phil?
Yes.
Will we be able to use the share function?
In your breakout rooms, I believe you will.
Okay.
Yes, you'll be able to.
Thank you. Because I want to share with everybody the questions again. It's been.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead and share it now, Jackie, and then I'll have to pull up something else.
Okay. Here we go. There we go.
Great. And so when Flavia, do you want to explain these consensus building questions real quickly?
Yes. So hello, everyone. So we have these 3 questions that will guide the next minutes of our event. So the first question is, what does resilient means conceptually? So here we want to understand what we think that this concept means and what are maybe the frameworks and the domains that we feel that are more important in conceptualizing our resilience. And of course, you can draw on all that we learned in the last 2 days. Then the next 8 minutes, we're going to spend on the second question, that what are the characteristics of resilience? And then we're thinking more specifically about the variables here that you can use to measure resilience and the types of measurements involved in that. And our last question would be, what are the unique context of caregivers and what is their role in resilience? So really going back to a lot of the presentations we had in the last 2 days that talked about the caregiving aspect and how this can impact our resilience. And then we're going to come back to the room. In each room, you're going to have a moderator, and the moderator will read these questions again to you. And then we're going to have 8 minutes that, you should engage in the conversation, really participate. We really want to hear your voices. That's what, it's the beauty of this event, is really the ability to connect and to talk. And then we're going to come back to the main room, and each one of the moderators will share these main points. And of course, we'll be sharing with you in the future what we, the summary of all that we learned today. Thank you.
All right, so these are the breakout rooms lists. And we will go ahead and start sorting people into these separate rooms.
Sophie, maybe can you just increase a little bit the size of your screen? Perfect.
Right, yeah, if you can see the room you're supposed to go into, you will click on the person and then join.
So the last thing I'll mention is that there are handouts where you can take notes on a Google Doc to synthesize your discussion, any notes you have, and your final answers. I'll go ahead and put a link to those documents that exist in English and in Spanish in the chat in case anyone wants to have that handy. There'll be a link you can click on to take you to your unique Google Doc for taking notes.
Thank you so much. And this could not have happened without Stephanie. And, of course, all the support that we had from Phil and the team at UTNB and all the organizers of this event. But a big thank you for you, Stephanie.
No, a big thank you to you, Flavia, on the contrary.
You all guys in your breakout rooms.
Hi, Fernando.
So if you just hover over the breakout room, if you click on breakout rooms and you see the name of the group, just over to the right where you see the number of people in that room, if you hover over that, there'll be an option to click on join, and you should be able to just join that group.
Oh, I see.
Uh-huh.
Jackie, have you figured that out?
No. Oh, there you go.
Uh-huh. So you'll go ahead and just click on join.
No idea. Wait a second. Here we are. Thank you, Stephanie.
Sure.
Our tech.
And for those of you who didn't see your names maybe in a particular group, feel free to go ahead and just join a group. I'll mention that in group 1, they'll be discussing in Spanish.
Okay, so I guess I'm in room
2.
Stephanie, how do you get into a group? I mean,
Yeah, so if you, happy to help. So if you click on just to the right, something that says breakout rooms down at the bottom of your Zoom window, do you see that option?
Breakout rooms. No, I don't see that option.
What do you see towards the bottom of your screen?
At the very bottom, it
says
the interpretation, reactions, pause, share, chat.
So just to the left of interpretation and reaction, there should be an option for breakout rooms. Is it just not there on your screen?
Yeah, it's just not there. I have pause.
Let me see if there's one of the conference hosts could help us with that. Oh, I wonder if it's because you've been given.
I'm here. I can just assign you to a room.
Great. I don't have the power to do that. So.
Do you have any preference for a room?
Let's see. How about I don't know. How about 5?
Sounds good. Sending you there now.
Thank you.
If anyone else needs to be assigned to a room, go ahead and drop it in the chat and I'll take care of it.
Rogelio, te encargo un momentito, ahorita regreso. Mariana, te encargo un momentito, ahorita regreso.
I think we're going bad.
Wonderful. Well, welcome back, everybody. I think we're all back into the main room now. So at this juncture, we'd like to just go around to the different groups and have the moderator go ahead and just synthesize the main takeaways from the various points that you discussed. So maybe we could start with room 1 with Mariana and Veronica. We can't hear you quite yet.
Sorry.
Okay.
We argue.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So sorry, because I couldn't hear either what you were saying. Sorry. So my audio was out, so I couldn't hear you either.
Oh, no problem. We were just saying that we would go around to the different groups and have each group just report on the main points that were discussed.
Okay.
Would you like
do you want to start or?
Yeah, so we'll start with group 1.
Okay. The first question: what is resilience? No, and we according with that, we don't have a consensus, a definitions in consensus in the scientific literature, but we recognize the skills to respond by the environment or some events. But this response depends to the context of each one. And the resilience maybe is for individual or collective resilience, no? And another thing very important is because the resilience we build resilience in the life course. Is because we learn about to be resilient in your environment, in your family, or in your context, or education, or in your community. And yesterday, Octavio Martinez said very, very interesting definition. He said, is the skills to join thought, behaviors, and actions to promote the individual, familiar, and community well-being through the development in the process to coping, adapting, or to vencer, no, the stress and the adversities. That we are very, very according with this definition, but only I suggest to put the time because the adversity, the learning to be resilient is in the life course. We learn it about in the life course, in the first stage of the life. And another very important thing is the agency. is the agency to mobilize resource in each event. That's it more or less, Mariana, no?
Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
That's it. Okay. By the second? Or what?
Sure. I think we could go ahead and just synthesize across the different points and then go group by group. Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
So sure, if you want to tell us a little bit about what you all discussed for questions 2 and 3. Yeah.
Fernando?
They just did.
Yeah.
No, Fernando, yeah. Fernando, he needs to get
You're on mute.
He's on mute.
I'm sorry. After a year of Zoom, you'd think we would all have it in our DNA when to take off the mute, excuse me. Well, I'll report back from our group, and we had a really interesting, I think, and value-added discussions about both conceptually what we mean by resilience and what it encompasses operationally. And I hope I summarized properly. First of all, I think I would say that how we use the term resiliency for our particular populations, Latinos in particular, and Latino elderly or ancianos, we are struggling with how we can apply that term for us to include our unique immigration history, cultural attributes, experiences. As one of our colleagues said, in bringing it to the community level, none of us who have overcome adversity, and we've all faced different levels of adversity, none of us goes around saying, I am resilient or I was resilient. So it's not a term we use in everyday language to talk about our day-to-day experiences or surviving. On the other hand, there is something about the emerging Latino population that gives them a different perspective than perhaps other racial groups. That so our goal may be not just to conceptualize the term resiliency so that we own it and it is part of our experiences, which is unique to whether Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Central Americans, or Mexicans, but that we can operationalize it in terms of the programs we pursue, our advocacy, our politics, our public policies, so that in a sense, when we talk about resiliency, we want to supplement the natural strengths of our community. We want to build and provide programs and policies that add to and empower our communities. Or as I use the phrase, we don't want to get caught up in what might be a trendy focus, especially when you talk about racial minorities. We are not victims and we don't want to be seen as victims. But on the other hand, we do have challenges, and it's how can we build on our strengths, whether it's family, community, aspirations, religion, so that we can build on those that we have for the last couple of 100 years. So I know it's still kind of a vague, abstract term, but I believe what I got from our discussions, how do we define and own and implement that term in terms of our research and also applying our research to whether it's programs, services, policy, advocacy. And please, anybody from our group weigh in. I'm sure I didn't capture the full extent of our discussions.
It's an important point that our group raised about having the source of that definition. Is it the academic definition? Is it the community? Everybody, we need to pay close attention to the use of the term and where it comes from.
Really fantastic points. Maybe we could go ahead and move on to group 3, just in the interest of time. So this was Cocos.
Okay, well, yeah, along the same lines, of course, we talked about the meaning of the term and the distinction between individual psychological resilience and family resilience, or family quality came up as a variable, in addition to the number of family members. And then really societal resilience and the notion of natural disasters and the increasing rate of natural disasters because of climate change has come up, and it's affecting Latinos and other minority groups and older people in a bigger way. And we need to deal with that. Other populations, like the extremely mentally ill, we tend to ignore them in our studies just because they're too small. Disabled people, other than just older people, but disabled, and so on. And so how do we prepare for the challenges that we've been facing throughout, but also with the challenges with the new world we live in, with pandemics and with natural disasters and climate change. Bob, you want to add anything? Anybody else from my group? Okay.
If Bob doesn't, I do want to say one of the things that we returned to a lot was the idea of multiple levels of resilience, a meso level, a micro level, and a macro level, and a relative lack of attention to the macro level and our conference, and how, you know, that's going to be a real step forward for us moving forward, is that we should really take the time to focus and appreciate the importance of the macro level structures in contextualizing resilience.
Very good. Anybody else? All right, Stephanie, you can move on.
Great, thank you so much. So we could go ahead and move on to group 4 with Lizette.
I need to unmute, sorry about that. I'm gonna share my screen because we wrote notes while we were doing this, and I've gone through, since we're group 4, I've gone through the trouble to organize them. So the first question, you know, what does resilience conceptually mean? And we did a lot of free association. So one of the things that came out is to really consider a life course perspective in our conceptualization and focus on identifying factors that build resiliency over the lifetime. When we look at the life course, we oftentimes think of how do we, you know, cumulative disadvantage. Resilience would be the opposite, what would build cumulative advantage over time. Of course, a lot of the presentations we saw yesterday had, you know, discussions about personality traits and their association with resiliency, but they don't occur in isolation. And so consider the interaction effects between the individual and the environment that leads to resiliency. This was Sandra's contribution. She really kept us honest with this one. One conceptualization that really stood out was the shift in yesterday's discussion about resilience isn't just bouncing back, but it's an adaptation or of coping that might mean a change in the individual or the environment. So you don't necessarily are returning to a previous form. And one environmental context to incorporate into the conceptualization of resilience is its manifestation within social networks. We all live within social networks. We know they change over time, and especially in the latter half of adulthood. And that people are embedded in these networks, and to consider how resiliency might influence the way they change as well. Consider other contextual factors such as the safety of environments and the role of gender. And so I hope my group chimes in here, because I went ahead and sort of took our thoughts and put it into a sentence. So for us, the beginning conceptualizations of resiliency is that it does not occur in a vacuum. It's influenced by social context and the roles we assume within those contexts. And the other thought is that it's bidirectional. You know, and obviously we don't quite know what the directions things, you know, what comes first. So anyways, that was our answer to question number 1. And please, Adriana, Brian, Sandra, weigh in if you want to add anything else to that.
That was a great summary.
Okay, good.
Great. Thank you so much. I guess we could go ahead and move on to Flavia's group.
Well, I know it's when you have like such great presentations before, there's very little to add. I think our group like consider that the ecological perspective in which we go from all the individual all the way to to the larger society, they want the way to go, really considering all these risks and protective factors. But as the other moderators already mentioned, it's that dynamic system, right? So it doesn't, like, you really have to look across time. And because we're looking across time also provides some difficulties, for example, if we are measuring it, because some of the factors might have occurred and we don't have information about it. So we have to be creative with like these measures, because it's really like this life course perspective. And when we only look at one slice of this period that is like the older age, we cannot isolate from what happened before, right? The other factor that some of you have already mentioned is that this complexity of the relationships. So when we talked about adaptations, not only the individual is adapting, the environment around the individual, the networks, and the dyads, if you were studying, for example, the caregivers, they're also changing and adapting to these changes over time. So it's like, it's really dynamic. And as we think about that is a complex model, is like how much we can incorporate, right? And the other challenge is that since we all come from different fields, we also have our different lenses in what resilience means, right? And how we can incorporate in our studies. So we have to be also mindful that different people, communities, or scholars will also have different perspectives on what resilience means. And that's important to look at. And we talked, like, since we are talking about this ecological perspective and all the social determinants, and all the risk factors and protective factors that we talked about, and like how these social factors become biological factors, right? Like, so how when they get under the skin, and that's the reference of the work from Eileen Kremens that Fernando shared with the group. So I'll stop here for question 1. Thank you. And if anyone from the group wants to add something, of course, I can never make justice, like I'm trying to look and organize and see what else we could add. Feel free to jump in.
Well, it seems like most groups synthesize kind of across the different questions. One area that you all could feel free to add some additional information about would be in terms of thinking about any particular measurements or methods that you guys discussed in your groups to maybe think about capturing resilience. I'm not sure if there was any detail that any of the groups felt like they wanted to add about that.
So I don't know that we didn't talk about this and it didn't come up, but I see it sort of across the presentations that have gone on throughout the conference, is measurements of depression, I think, and like the CESD score could be a really useful tool for looking at resilience, a particular type of resilience at least, right? So the extent to which people are experiencing depressive symptoms as a result of health problems or their ability to bounce back from experiencing depressive symptoms is, it was apparent in a couple of the presentations we saw. And I think there's a lot of work to be done with depression as an important part of this resilience.
And something very important is to notice that the resilience is a concept interdisciplinary, in the interdisciplinary way, because at the first moment, resilience is the engineering, so psychologists or something, but now we have a conscience, is a very interdisciplinary concept, because the stress and the depression and other symptoms or adversities, the elderly and the older generations make mechanisms to resilience, no? And that's very important to notice the social determinants at the first stage of the life, no? The health event, no? Disease in timing at the first moment in the life, education, employment. What about to the households or family stabilization? No, somebody said yesterday about to the security, the food security, for example, no, the structural racism, no. We have different environments, very stressful for the people, no, and that is we don't have a model perfectly in this way, no, but we have stress and social supports, for example. We have depression and care and social support. And maybe we need to think in some kind of model very in this sense interdisciplinary, because the self-esteem, the personality, how we can to measure the agency, for example. No, the agency is very, very important because it's the mechanism to the resilience. And our group has said about to the self-efficiency, for example, no? And that's inputs are very important because we learn about it. We teach about it, how to fight adversity, because we have different instruments or tools in psychological, in sociological, in social work, in anthropological, we have a different forms to teach and learn about this agency or to these mobilized resources in the life. Obviously for the elderly people, no, for this obvious. Okay.
Well, our group is unique in that we do take a transdisciplinary approach. Exhibit A, in terms of all our different perspectives, both intellectual as well as practical. And I think that's what was revealed in our group, and we need to be extra sensitive to that. One thing that came up in our group was looking at changes in our measures, and changes in health and function as a result of economic shocks or a global pandemic, and how to be able to come up with other measures, including the comorbidity and the term called synthetic, which I think is important, syndemic rather, I think has brought a lot of attention to looking at these new morbidities in our population that has been disproportionately taken a differential toll on us. So we've been hit hard, and it's going to happen again. So what can we do for understanding how to build and foster this resilience and this adaptation amid shrinking public resources in many cases for certain communities, right? We have successful models, but we also have less successful municipalities, and it's all at the local level, mainly in terms of what we're talking about now, especially with respect to mental health.
So just jump in for like our group, in terms of the measures, like we revisit the stressors, the mechanisms, and the outcome variables. And some of the measures that some of you have mentioned, but we talked a little bit more, was like self-efficacy, locks of control, measures that capture ability to change and to adapt. And then, some of that we mentioned before, mental health, racism, And then measure dysregulation and accumulation of stress over the life course, including measures such as orthostatic load and cortisol, but also social measures that get to the core of like social engagement and social connections. That will be also important. And, you know, because of the time that we talked, the importance of like analyzing time, the early life conditions, and all these measures that can measure cumulative disadvantages would be important too.
Are we going by number of group? Or can my group go?
Yeah, at this point, just anyone who would like to share.
Are we on number 2, question number 2, right?
I think some groups talked about all questions and some groups are just kind of chiming in, but yeah, we were talking about some of the measures and methods, so more aligned with number 2.
Okay, so I'll share my screen. When we looked at characteristics, we acknowledged that it was very difficult to define. There aren't a whole lot of good measures for it, or there's a lot of different measures for it. And so we thought about the idea of using proxies and what kinds of things signal, resiliency, and, you know, what kinds of things would be sort of shortcuts. What works in the lab, you know, in terms of a 20-item measure versus in a clinic where you need something very quick. So we were sort of coming from that mindset. So we talked about the idea of cognitive flexibility, somebody's ability to change. It helps with adaptation. Brian talked about very much the cognitive reserves that some people tend to have. Usually is a proxy for education level, but it's not always the case. From Silva and Joe's presentation yesterday, or Sylvia, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Sylvia's presentation, we looked at markers of early childhood experiences as predictors to later resiliency. And then we talked about like the internal locus of control. Do they feel like they have control over their environment? A sense of agency and human agency to make use of the resources within the environment, the purpose of life, and how the person has negotiated their environment and how they respond to the stressors. Again, we were trying to figure out like, okay, what kinds of items and things we would think about if we were going to measure this. So our synthesis, and this is, I give credit to Adriana, you know, people's sense of agency to adapt to the changes in their environment and their ability to creatively adapt to their environment. And so the sense of, you know, agency and adaptation in a particular context was sort of our take-home message. And please, guys, weigh in if I have forgotten something.
Actually, I wanted just to ask Fernando to add to this question about operationalization. Your thoughts from our group as well.
Well, I really like the way the set you presented yours, especially the intergenerational, the narrative, the changing circumstances. And I think Jackie's asking me to just comment on right now, for example, at the federal level, there's great debate about what will constitute the social safety net, and the Congress and the administration is struggling with what will be in that social safety net. And so it begs the question, is the definition of resiliency being based on one way to look at it where we are seen as victims, or that it's a racialized world? Or is it going to be based upon what are the services and programs that will enable our communities to move forward? So in that regard, just to throw an example, I would advocate with the administration and the Congress, we as Latinos are not looking for reparations necessarily. It's not about critical race theory for us. It's about subsidized daycare. It's about support for community colleges. It's about expanding Medicare to include dental coverage. And so for myself at this level, I would say, if I'm going to use the term resiliency for the aging of our population and the youthful and the emerging population, these are the things that build upon our willingness, ability to continue to cope, not to be victims, but to continue to push and struggle and and move forward. And so what helps us to continue to do that as opposed to what can be done for us? And so at the policy level, I think we need to struggle with the public narrative. Are we being seen as a racialized, are we being seen as a racial oppressed minority? Or are we being seen as a striving, emerging Latino population that wants to move forward and can benefit from certain types of services and support? So at least for those on the policy level, we want to use the term resiliency, but not in the way it's used in some circle as victimization, therefore you get this, versus we're willing to do the work and therefore this will help us. So I think that's what you're referring to, Jackie.
Yes. Yes, and also we're talking about social resources, as Flavia said, is important, both with respect to the community as well as federal and state and local funding. That could be an indicator as well for the area health resource file.
I think that's an important, this is Bill Vega. I think that's an important point of clarification that was just made by Fernando, because really you're talking, the difficulty here is that we're talking about what's the difference in the unit of analysis. Is it the population level? Is it the family member level? Is it the dyad between an individual and a caregiver? You know, these are critical questions. I mean, they all have policy level responses, but I agree that at the global level, the support network process, that's a fundamental stepping stone issue. And of course, you know, it doesn't necessarily relate to all the kinds of research we've heard here today, because, you know, we're dealing at a different level there. But I think that it has to be understood that, you know, we're never going to change the nature of these issues or the nature of our vulnerability as a population group if we focus on one-by-one approaches. You do have to do everything simultaneously. So I give a lot of kudos to Fernando and his group for bringing that focus in, you know, because we need that focus so desperately to be able to translate our thoughts and what we see as vulnerabilities that fall through all of these different levels of unit of analysis because of the fact that they're all affected by these meta issues associated with inequality and persistent discrimination and you know, simply being left out of the process of mobility and educational accomplishment.
May I say something?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Well, I would like to say that talking about Mexico and Latin America, and maybe the Latino population in the United States, is that aging is different because of intrinsic reasons. And one of the big problems about the problems that are coming with aging, about resilience, is if we can afford to have all the measures and needs that are required. Can we afford that in an economy like Mexico? And we are having another problem with aging, okay? And that requires a lot of resources and money. So we have to recognize what are the contingencies that we are going to face in the coming aging, in the coming process of aging. And those contingencies are of several kinds. One is economic, in the sense that we need resources for to afford the daily living of the aging. One very heavy is going to be the need to medical attention and medical problems and prevention. That will be very, very important thing. And of course, is the problem of the family structure and all that is required to take care of the elderly and also for the resilience. So that kind of problems can be approached if we just make a money value of those things. I am talking from a very actuarial perspective because that's what what I'm doing. And the proposal is to take this approach into this problem of aging and silence and prevention and all that. I'm saying that because I have a project now that is being financed by CONACYT, and I would like to extend that to Latin America. I would like to talk to Flavia about this, and I would like to have the notice that Lisette Piedra show us in the screen, and I want to say thank you for this opportunity for this conference that I think that I personally will have a lot of things to profit from the ideas and concepts that I have learned in these 2 days. Thank you very much. And I will approach Flavia, which is smiling, and Piedra, and everybody of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roberto. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I know that we still had a lot of to cover on the third question, but I think we already actually talked about some of the uniqueness of working with Latinos in both US and Mexico. And I know that the moderators took very good notes about this discussion. At this point, I'm really here to invite you to continue this conversation next year when we meet in Chicago. And I'll pass now the conversation to Jackie and Phil to end. But before that, I really want to thank Stephanie for really co-hosting this event, the consensus building session with me. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you, Flavia.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Flavia and Stephanie, bravo for moderating a very informative discussion and also very insightful. Can't wait to see the results. I think you'll be following up with everyone. Number 2, I'm so impressed with the turnout. It's Friday and it's just really been a very special event. This is the first time we've ever had this done. I want to thank Phil Cantu and the UTMB team. A shout out to everyone there for making this possible. Frank Bandiera, our program officer. Frank, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here.
We really appreciate all your support. This would not be possible without NIA's R13 competing renewal. You are the source of everything we do, and we appreciate your guidance quite often in how we're going to move ahead as well. Robert Wallace, Bob Wallace, you're still with us, Bob. Yeah, merci, gracias, and thank you again. You've been our guiding light in moving us in the right direction, and we appreciate that. Also, our moral compass, intellectual versatility, and making sure that we're covering everything from our social and behavioral aspects to our biobehavioral dimensions, to all the questions that we're asking in our public health relevance. We take this very seriously. Moving ahead, as Flavia said, the team here, we have Fernando Rios Mena is going to be hosting next year along with Martha DeViglis at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I hope everybody can come. We're going to have hopefully be in person, although this has worked beautifully, so we may end up becoming hybrid. So we're going to pray for everybody's safety though in the meantime, and thanks to Octavio Martinez again for keeping us up to date on that. I also want to point out that the papers. There will be a special issue that's being considered at Journal of Aging and Health, and we're going to be making some revisions to the prospectus, and it's the co-editors are Veronica Montes de Oca and Rogelio Sainz, and myself. We'll be pulling that all together, including we want to pull together all of these and synthesize these results so we can, again, start setting new directions and discoveries. We have learned a lot, and so I'm going to stop there and see if there's any smoldering questions, and also toss it back to Phil Cantu and Cocos and the Galveston team and Rogelio and our co-organizers, Vero, for any closing thoughts.
Well, we want to thank you for your leadership over so many years, and for all the people out there, senior and junior. And we've had a tremendous attendance, really. So, and thanks to Phil Cantu, especially for his organization. And of course, the money from NIA, and the sources, and yeah. It's been a wonderful 2 days, and there will be a product, the Journal of Aging and Health. We'll work with you and make sure that we get a product out of this that will be useful.
We'll have it before next year. I also just want to remind everyone that for those of you who are going to be participating in the Gerontology Society of America, we will be presenting and updating many of these results and an opportunity to discuss this. It will be via Zoom. We will not be in Phoenix, but please join us with more information to come. I will be sending that out on the listserv. And then thank you, Cocos, for everything. It really means a lot to all of us, especially our emerging scholars, our early investigators. I know many of you are, in transition now, and it's very exciting, very gratifying to see everyone doing so well. Adriana, it's wonderful to see you up, someone from the East Coast, Northeast, I should say. I hope all is well. And let's see, everybody else, Brian, Luis, Mariana, Roberto, what more can I say? Our Mexico team. And just everyone else.
Al contrario, Jackie, que gracias a todos por su presencia y por la paciencia y por, sobre todo ustedes también en la organización central, Jackie, Phil, cada detalle cuenta en estas cosas, es muy importante. Y para la UNAM es súper estar con ustedes, volvernos a ver, escucharnos e ir avanzando en la investigación de los latinos y los mexicanos en Estados Unidos. Así que está nuestro corazón con ustedes y nuestro compromiso. Muchas gracias, Jackie, Cocos, Rogelio, Will, everybody. Gracias.
Wonderful. What I'm going to recommend is one last point here. My undergraduate student volunteered to take some notes, Anja Danke. So Anja, can you put your video on so we can see you? There you go, just to say wave from UT Austin, and thank you for that as well. Just in terms of our reactions, because I want to end on a super positive note. You can add a reaction.
Yeah, reactions, everybody.
Yeah.
Fireworks.
Yeah, it's a lot of hard work, beautiful work, but it paid. Fernando, thanks for everything.
And I'll say a few words.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, and it was a wonderful conference. Really enjoyed it very much. And the major thing is that it was the 20th anniversary, right, Jackie? That this has started in 2001, and I think that the fruits that have been bared by your efforts, Jackie, especially the emerging scholars, and it's so nice to see people that were graduate students that are now leaders in the field. It's really tremendous to see.
It is just phenomenal. But that's what we're all about. And the level of commitment is just, it just can't be measured. It's off the charts. So with all that said, anything else before we turn our Zooms off for the night?
Thank you, Jackie. I just wanted to thank you.
Gracias. one last point, we will have all these slides available and put that on the website. So more to come. Thank you again. And
thank you everyone for your hard
stay
work.
healthy and stay safe, please.